Across 4 decades of continuous military campaigning, the man who would become Genghis Khan conquered more territory than any individual in recorded human history, subduing the Jin dynasty of northern China with its population of 50 million people, annihilating the Khwarezmian Empire that controlled Central Asia from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, opening trade routes that would connect the Mediterranean world to the courts of China for the first time since antiquity, establishing a legal code that would govern the largest contiguous land empire ever assembled, and creating a military system so sophisticated that his descendants would continue his conquests for another 70 years after his death, until Mongol cavalry had reached the shores of the Pacific, the banks of the Danube, the walls of Damascus, and the rice paddies of Vietnam. But on the banks of the Anon River, in the northeastern corner of the Mongolian steppe, sometime around the year 1162, when a woman named Hoelun gave birth to a boy she would name Temujin, within a felt-walled tent that could be dismantled and packed onto horses within an hour, the world into which this child emerged offered no indication that he would become anything more than another minor figure in the endless cycles of tribal warfare, alliance, and betrayal that had defined steppe existence for millennia. His father Yesugei controlled a small following of perhaps several hundred families. His clan, the Borjigin, held no particular distinction among the dozens of Mongol clans scattered across the grasslands, and the fractured political landscape of the steppe provided no foundation upon which any lasting unity might be constructed. This is the story of the Mongol Empire from its origins in the hardscrabble existence of nomadic pastoralists on the Central Asian grasslands, through the brutal consolidation of power that transformed scattered tribes into a unified military force, the campaigns of conquest that would bring the ancient civilizations of China, Persia, and the Islamic world under Mongol dominion, the administrative innovations that allowed a people without written language or urban experience to govern populations numbering in the hundreds of millions, the internal conflicts and succession crises that would gradually fragment the empire into separate khanates, and the slow decline that would see Mongol rulers absorbed into the sedentary civilizations they had conquered, until the last echoes of Mongol imperial authority faded in the 17th century, more than 400 years after Temujin first drew breath on the Onon River. The world of the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century represented one of the most demanding environments for human habitation anywhere on Earth, a vast expanse of grassland stretching across some 2 million square kilometres between the Siberian forest to the north and the Gobi Desert to the south, subject to temperature variations that could range from 40 degrees below zero in winter to over 30 degrees above in summer, supporting human populations through a system of pastoral nomadism that required constant movement across the landscape in search of adequate grazing for the herds of horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels upon which all economic and social life depended. The Mongolian climate permitted no agriculture, offered no permanent water sources adequate for large settled populations, and provided no natural resources that might support urban development or craft specialization, conditions that had shaped the steppe peoples into mobile communities whose entire material culture needed to be transportable, whose military skills were developed from childhood through the constant practice of riding and hunting, and whose political structures remained fluid and impermanent precisely because no single leader could accumulate the economic surplus necessary to maintain standing armies or permanent administrative systems. The political landscape into which Temujin was born reflected this environmental reality with remarkable precision, consisting of numerous tribal confederations that formed, expanded, contracted, and dissolved according to the military success or failure of their leaders, the availability of external sources of wealth through trade or raiding, and the complex dynamics of marriage alliances and blood feuds that connected and divided the various peoples of the steppe. The Mongols themselves constituted only one of several major ethnic or linguistic groups inhabiting the region, sharing the grasslands with the Tatars to the east, the Merkits to the north, the Naimans to the west, the Karaits in the central steppe, and numerous smaller groups whose allegiances shifted with the political winds. None of these peoples maintained anything resembling a permanent state structure, and the very concept of stable political authority running across generations remained foreign to steppe political culture, where a confederation might rise to regional dominance under a successful Khan, only to fragment immediately upon his death, as subordinate leaders reasserted their independence, and former allies became rivals competing for the resources the dead leader had accumulated. Yesugei, the father of Temujin, operated within this fluid political environment as a minor chieftain whose primary asset was his connection to past greatness rather than any substantial present power, his lineage tracing back to a figure named Kublai Khan, who had briefly unified several Mongol clans earlier in the century and conducted raids against the Jin dynasty that controlled northern China. This connection to a remembered period of Mongol strength provided Yesugei with a certain prestige among the Borjigin clan and its associated followers, but it did not translate into the kind of military strength that would have made his position secure against the constant threats posed by rival Mongol clans, the powerful Tatar Confederation to the east, or the Merkits to the north, with whom the Mongols maintained a particularly bitter enmity, rooted in decades of mutual raiding, abduction, and blood feud. The circumstances of Temujin's birth already carried the marks of this violent world, occurring shortly after Yesugei had returned from a campaign against the Tatars during which he had captured a Tatar chieftain named Temujin Uge, a victory that prompted the naming of his newborn son after this defeated enemy, according to a steppe tradition that sought to transfer the spiritual power of conquered foes to newborn children. The practice reflected a worldview in which personal qualities were understood to flow from external sources rather than inheriting through bloodlines alone, and in which the acquisition of power required the deliberate appropriation of strength from those one had overcome, a conceptual framework that would prove remarkably consistent with the adult Temujin's approach to incorporating defeated enemies into his own following, rather than simply eliminating them. The early childhood of the future Genghis Khan unfolded within the demanding rhythms of nomadic life. The constant cycle of seasonal migrations that took Yesugei's small group from winter camps in protected valleys, where wind and snow could be survived, to summer pastures on the open steppe, where the grasses grew thick enough to support the herds through months of intensive grazing. Children on the steppe learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, developing the skills in horsemanship that would later form the foundation of Mongol military superiority, while the hunting of small game with bow and arrow began in early childhood and progressed to participation in the large-scale communal hunts that provided much of the meat supply, while simultaneously serving as exercises in the coordination and discipline required for military operations. The material culture of the steppe peoples placed children in close contact with animals from their earliest years. The felt tents known as jer, constructed from the wool of sheep, the leather goods produced from cattle hides, the kumis fermented from mare's milk that served as the basic beverage, and the horses that provided transportation, military capability, and a form of wealth that could be accumulated, displayed, and traded in ways that other nomadic assets could not. Temujin's mother Hoelun herself embodied the violent circumstances that characterized relations among the steppe peoples, having been abducted by Yesugei while travelling to her original husband's camp among the Merkits, a seizure that transformed what would have been an alliance between Merkit and Olkonud clans into a source of lasting enmity that would threaten Temujin's life in years to come. The practice of bride abduction, while not universal among steppe peoples, occurred frequently enough that it represented a recognised, if not entirely accepted, form of marriage acquisition, and the feuds it generated could persist across generations as injured families sought revenge for the insults to their honour and the loss of women who represented valuable alliance assets. Hoelun herself appears to have accepted her situation with the pragmatism that characterised steppe women's approach to circumstances they could not control, bearing Yesugei 4 sons, including Temujin, along with a daughter, while Yesugei also maintained a second wife who produced additional children, creating a household structure that would generate its own internal tensions in the years following Yesugei's death. The death of Yesugei occurred when Temujin was approximately 9 years old, an event that transformed the boy's circumstances from those of a minor chieftain's son to those of an impoverished outcast whose survival itself became uncertain. The circumstances of Yesugei's death revealed both the dangers and the social dynamics of steppe existence, occurring when he accepted hospitality from a group of Tatars while returning from arranging Temujin's betrothal to a girl from the Ongirat clan, the Tatars having recognised him as the man who had conducted raids against them years earlier and poisoned the food they offered in revenge. Yesugei managed to reach his own camp before dying, but could do nothing to secure the position of his family in his absence, and the fragility of political authority on the steppe immediately manifested itself as the families that had followed Yesugei began to drift away to attach themselves to more powerful leaders who could offer better protection and opportunities for advancement. The abandonment of Temujin's family represented the expected outcome within steppe political culture, where followers owed loyalty to individuals rather than to lineages or institutions, and where a dead leader's dependents became liabilities rather than assets to those who had served under him. The Secret History of the Mongols, the court chronicle composed approximately 25 years after Temujin's death, that provides the most detailed account of his early life, describes the departure of Yasugei's followers in terms that emphasize the cruelty and disloyalty of those who abandoned his widows and children. But this moral framing overlays what was in fact standard behaviour within a system that provided no mechanisms for maintaining political authority across generational transitions. Holan and her co-wife Sochigel were left with their young children and virtually no followers, reduced to subsistent survival on the margins of the steppe society they had previously inhabited as members of a recognised if modest political community. The years following Yasugei's death tested the survival capabilities of Temujin and his family in the most direct possible terms, forcing them to sustain themselves through fishing, hunting small game, and gathering the roots and berries that supplemented steppe diets during periods when other food sources were inadequate. The Secret History describes this period as one of extreme hardship, during which the family's poverty forced them into activities that carried low status in a society that valued pastoral wealth and military capability, the catching of fish and the hunting of marmots representing survival strategies associated with the poorest and most marginal steppe populations. This period of deprivation would later be incorporated into Temujin's origin mythology as evidence of the adversity he had overcome and the resilience he had demonstrated, but at the time it represented simply the desperate circumstances of a family that had lost its social position and had no obvious means of regaining it. The circumstances of this marginal existence also generated the first recorded violence in which Temujin participated, the killing of his half-brother Bekta in a dispute over the distribution of hunting spoils that the Secret History describes as a response to Bekta's repeated claims to food that Temujin and his full brother Kasar had obtained. The killing of a family member represented a serious transgression even within the violent norms of steppe society, and Holan reportedly condemned her sons bitterly for the act, recognising that it further weakened their already precarious position by eliminating a potential ally and demonstrating a willingness to violate kinship obligations that would make others wary of associating with them. The incident nonetheless revealed qualities in the young Temujin that would characterise his later career, including a willingness to use violence against those who threatened his interests regardless of social or familial constraints, a sense of prerogative that rejected subordination, even when circumstances might have argued for accommodation, and an apparent capacity to undertake lethal action without the hesitation or remorse that might have deterred others in similar situations. The aftermath of the killing brought additional hardship when members of the Taijud clan, which had been among those that abandoned Temujin's family after Yasugei's death, seized the young man and placed him in a kangwe, the wooden collar restraint used to immobilize captives and criminals that prevented its wearer from feeding himself or performing basic tasks necessary for survival. The Taijud action may have been motivated by concern that the young Temujin might eventually seek revenge for their earlier abandonment, or it may have represented simply the predatory behaviour of a more powerful group toward a weaker one, but in either case it placed Temujin in a position where his death or permanent subjugation seemed the most likely outcomes. His escape from the Taijud, achieved with the assistance of a sympathetic family that sheltered him at considerable risk to themselves, became one of the formative episodes of his later legend, demonstrating both the ability to inspire loyalty in unexpected quarters and the determination to survive circumstances that would have broken individuals of lesser will. The period of Temujin's adolescence and early adulthood saw the gradual reconstruction of his social position through the careful cultivation of relationships that would provide the foundation for his later rise to power. The connection to his betrothed Borte, arranged by Yasugei before his death, and maintained despite the family's reduced circumstances, provided both an alliance with the Ongirat clan and a personal relationship that would prove remarkably durable throughout Temujin's life, Borte remaining his primary wife and the mother of his recognised heirs, even as he accumulated numerous secondary wives and concubines through conquest in later years. The marriage to Borte also brought a valuable diplomatic gift in the form of a sable fur coat of exceptional quality, which Temujin immediately deployed in pursuit of a more significant alliance by presenting it to Togrul Khan of the Keriets, the most powerful confederation in the central Mongolian steppe, and a leader with whom Yasugei had maintained a sworn brotherhood relationship known as Anda. The approach to Togrul exemplified the strategic intelligence that would characterize Temujin's political career, recognizing that his family's sole remaining asset of significance was the remembered relationship between his father and this powerful ruler, and that the gift of the sable coat could invoke obligations of reciprocity that might translate into concrete support. Togrul accepted the gift and acknowledged the Anda relationship as transferable to Yesugei's son, providing Temujin with a powerful patron whose protection would prove essential in the coming years, though the relationship would eventually produce its own conflicts as Temujin's power grew to the point where the patron-client dynamic became untenable. The securing of Keriot patronage represented Temujin's first major political achievement, demonstrating his ability to convert limited resources into valuable relationships through the astute management of steppe diplomatic conventions and the projection of personal qualities that inspired confidence in his potential value as an ally and subordinate. The protection of Togrul proved necessary almost immediately when the Merkits launched a raid on Temujin's small camp in retaliation for Yesugei's abduction of Hoelun a generation earlier, seizing Borte and carrying her off to become the wife of a Merkit warrior. The raid demonstrated the persistence of blood feuds across generations, and the vulnerability of any individual or small group on the steppe to violence from those with greater numbers and fewer constraints, while also testing the value of the relationships Temujin had cultivated, and his ability to mobilize responses to threats that he could not address through his own limited resources. Temujin appealed to Togrul for assistance, and also to a young Mongol chieftain named Jamuka, with whom he had developed an Anda relationship of his own, and the combined forces of these allies mounted a successful counter-raid against the Merkits that recovered Borte and established Temujin's reputation as someone capable of organizing military action that produced results. The recovery of Borte created a complication that would shadow Temujin's lineage for generations, as she returned from Merkit captivity pregnant with a child whose paternity could not be established with certainty, the period of her captivity having been long enough that either Temujin or her Merkit captor might have fathered the boy she subsequently bore. Temujin acknowledged this child, named Jochi, as his son and included him among his recognized heirs, but doubts about Yoki's legitimacy would persist and would contribute to succession disputes in later years, with Yoki's descendants ultimately establishing their dominion in the westernmost territories of the Mongol Empire, where distance from the Mongolian heartland provided a buffer against the challenges to their status that might have been pressed more effectively in closer proximity to the other branches of the imperial family. The episode illuminated both the violence endemic to steppe existence and the pragmatic approach to matters of legitimacy and succession that would characterize Mongol political culture, where demonstrated capability mattered more than formal bloodlines, and where the incorporation of individuals with ambiguous backgrounds remained common practice throughout the imperial period. The relationship with Jamuka that had proven so valuable in the Merkit campaign soon demonstrated the inherent instability of alliances on the steppe, as the two young leaders grew from companions into rivals, whose competition for followers would eventually culminate in open warfare. The transformation of their relationship reflected the fundamental dynamics of steppe political organization, where leaders advanced by attracting followers, and where the most capable warriors and families naturally gravitated toward those who seemed most likely to provide them with opportunities for advancement and protection from threats. Temujin and Jamuka initially cooperated closely enough that the secret history describes them as sharing blankets and exchanging the gifts of loyalty that symbolize their sworn brotherhood. But as each accumulated followers and demonstrated leadership capability, the maintenance of equality between them became impossible, and the question of which would subordinate himself to the other generated tensions that proved irreconcilable. The separation between Temujin and Jamuka occurred in a characteristically steppe fashion, with families and individuals choosing to follow one leader or the other based on their assessments of relative advantage, creating a division that split not only the Tuandi but the broader Mongol population into competing camps. The secret history portrays this division as driven by divine favour toward Temujin, with supernatural signs and prophecies indicating that he was destined for greatness. But the practical dynamics involved the same calculations of interest and capability that governed all steppe political relationships, with those who chose Temujin apparently betting that his more inclusive approach to followers and his more generous distribution of spoils would serve their interests better than attachment to Jamuka. The accumulation of followers represented the essential metric of political success on the steppe, and Temujin's ability to attract them, even when competing against Ananda with comparable resources and connections, demonstrated qualities of leadership that would prove consistently effective throughout his career. The rivalry with Jamuka produced military confrontations that tested Temujin's still developing capabilities and revealed both his strengths and his vulnerabilities as a war leader. The Battle of Dalan Baljut, occurring approximately in the 1180s, resulted in a defeat for Temujin that forced him to retreat and regroup, a setback that might have ended the career of a leader with less resilience and less ability to maintain follower loyalty through adversity. The defeat demonstrated that Temujin's rise would not proceed in a linear fashion, and that the eventual unification of the steppe remained distant and uncertain, requiring years of additional conflict, alliance building, and political maneuvering before anything resembling stable dominion could be achieved. Temujin's response to defeat exemplified the pattern that would characterize his approach to setbacks throughout his life, involving neither despair nor reckless attempts at immediate revenge, but rather the patient rebuilding of strength and the cultivation of opportunities that would eventually allow him to resume his advancement. The complex political landscape of the Mongolian steppe in the 1190s saw Temujin navigate among multiple power centres, maintaining his relationship with Togrul Khan while managing the rivalry with Jamuka and contending with the claims of various Mongol clans to leadership status. The Mongol tribes themselves had developed a tradition of recognizing paramount leaders through assemblies known as Kurultai, and in approximately 1189 or 1190, such an assembly elevated Temujin to the position of Khan of the Mongols, though this title at the time implied leadership only over those Mongol clans and families that chose to acknowledge his authority rather than the universal dominion the title would later connote. The assumption of the Khan title represented both recognition of what Temujin had already achieved in terms of follower accumulation and an assertion of legitimacy that went beyond his actual power, claiming a status that would require years of additional struggle to make real. The patronage of Togrul Khan remained essential during this period, with Temujin participating in campaigns organised by his Keriot overlord and benefiting from the protection that association with the most powerful steppe confederation provided against his various enemies. The relationship also created tensions, however, as Temujin's growing strength made the patron-client dynamic increasingly artificial, with Togrul's own followers reportedly resenting the disproportionate role that Temujin played in joint military operations, and the danger that his continued rise would eventually subordinate the Karaits to their nominal client. The eventual rupture of the Karaite alliance would represent one of the decisive transitions in Temujin's career, eliminating the most significant alternative power centre on the central steppe and consolidating the resources that would make the subsequent phase of Mongol expansion possible. Before that rupture occurred, however, Temujin faced and overcame a series of challenges that tested his capabilities and gradually established his dominion over the Mongol tribes themselves. The Tatars, the powerful Eastern Confederation that had poisoned his father decades earlier, became targets of a systematic campaign of destruction that reflected both personal revenge and strategic calculation, the Tatar position adjacent to the Jin dynasty frontier, making them potential rivals for access to Chinese resources, while their strength posed a continuing threat to Mongol security. The Tatar campaigns of the late 1190s and early 1200s resulted in the near-total annihilation of the Tatar tribal structure, with adult male survivors massacred and women and children distributed among Mongol families for absorption into the victor population, a pattern of destruction and incorporation that would characterize Mongol conquests throughout the imperial period. The elimination of the Tatars both removed a threat and demonstrated a capacity for organized military violence that exceeded anything previously seen on the steppe, warning other populations of the consequences of resistance while encouraging those who might be persuaded to submit voluntarily. The systematic nature of the Tatar destruction revealed military and organizational capabilities that distinguished Temujin's forces from typical steppe formations, suggesting the emergence of command structures and operational discipline that went beyond the loosely coordinated raids and campaigns that characterized traditional tribal warfare. The development of these capabilities reflected years of practical experience, the recruitment of skilled advisors and subordinates, and innovations in military organization that Temujin introduced or adopted during his decades of conflict on the steppe, though the precise timing and nature of these developments remain obscure due to the limited sources available for this period of his career. The eventual Mongol military system, with its decimal organization, its sophisticated communications and logistics, and its integration of diverse tactical capabilities, represented the culmination of an evolutionary process that began during these formative campaigns and continued to develop throughout the period of expansion. The final years of the 12th century and the opening years of the 13th saw Temujin move toward the decisive confrontations that would eliminate his remaining rivals and establish his unchallenged authority over the Mongolian steppe. Jamuka, whose rivalry with Temujin had persisted through various alliances and conflicts over nearly 2 decades, attempted to organize a coalition against his former Anda, but the forces he assembled proved inadequate against Temujin's now superior strength, and the coalition collapsed without achieving significant military results. The Karaite relationship reached its breaking point in 1203, when tensions between Temujin and Togrul's designated heir generated a conflict that escalated into open warfare between the former allies, culminating in battles that destroyed Karaite power and incorporated their population into Temujin's growing confederation. The Naiman, the westernmost of the major steppe peoples, faced their own destruction the following year, their defeat completing the elimination of all significant alternative power centres on the Mongolian steppe, and creating conditions for the formal proclamation of unified authority that would follow in 1206. The Karaite campaign in particular demonstrated both the military capabilities Temujin had developed and the personal qualities that made him effective as a leader in desperate circumstances. The initial phase of the conflict went badly for Temujin, with Karaite forces nearly overwhelming his smaller army and forcing a retreat that left his position seemingly desperate. The response to this crisis revealed the ability to maintain follower loyalty under the most adverse conditions, with Temujin reportedly drinking muddy water from a small pool and sharing the hardship of his men in ways that reinforced their commitment to his cause despite the apparent hopelessness of their situation. The reorganization and eventual counter-offensive that destroyed Karaite power demonstrated resilience, tactical adaptability, and the capacity to inspire continued effort from followers who might reasonably have abandoned a leader whose fortunes seemed to have failed, qualities that would prove equally important during the challenging phases of later campaigns against far more formidable opponents. The years of conflict and consolidation that preceded the 1206 proclamation also saw Temujin develop the administrative and legal frameworks that would eventually govern his empire, though the precise dating of many of these innovations remains uncertain. The promotion of individuals based on demonstrated capability rather than aristocratic lineage, which would become one of the distinctive features of Mongol imperial administration, clearly operated during the unification period, with men of humble origin rising to positions of significant authority based on their services to Temujin rather than their family backgrounds. The organization of military forces into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, which would provide the basic structure of Mongol armies throughout the imperial period, also appears to have been implemented during the unification campaigns, though it may have built upon earlier Mongol or broader steppe precedents. The legal principles that would eventually be codified as the Great Yasa, the body of law attributed to Genghis Khan that would govern Mongol society for generations, similarly developed during this period through accumulated decisions and precedents, rather than through any single act of legislation. The transformation of the Mongol tribes from a collection of competing clans and families into a unified political and military force represented an achievement without precedent in the history of the Central Asian steppe, where previous confederations had risen and fallen with the fortunes of individual leaders and had never survived the succession transitions that inevitably occurred when founding figures died. The mechanisms through which Temujin created more durable structures of authority included the deliberate breaking of traditional tribal bonds through the reassignment of individuals to new units commanded by leaders chosen for their loyalty and capability rather than their kinship connections, the establishment of an imperial guard force drawn from across the Confederation whose members developed primary loyalty to the Khan himself rather than to their original tribes or families, and the creation of administrative positions that provided ambitious individuals with opportunities for advancement through service to the central authority rather than through the traditional channels of tribal leadership. These innovations reached their formal expression in the Great Kurultai of 1206, assembled on the banks of the Onon River near the site where Temujin had been born, approximately 44 years earlier, where the assembled leaders of the now unified Mongol Confederation proclaimed him Genghis Khan, a title whose precise meaning remains debated, but which clearly implied universal sovereignty over all the peoples of the steppe, and, by extension, claims to dominion that would soon reach far beyond the grasslands of Mongolia. The assumption of this title marked the transition from tribal leader to imperial founder, from the Khan of the Mongols to the sovereign of an entity that would soon encompass populations whose existence the assembled Mongol chieftains could barely imagine. Civilizations whose complexity and wealth exceeded anything the steppe had ever produced, and territories whose extent would eventually dwarf the Mongolian homeland to insignificance. The man who stood before this assembly had travelled an extraordinary distance from the abandoned child surviving on marmots and fish roots on the margins of steppe society, but the qualities that had enabled this journey remained consistent with those that would drive the subsequent decades of conquest. The capacity for violence without apparent constraint had manifested from the killing of Bekta through the destruction of the Tatars, while the ability to inspire loyalty and incorporate former enemies into his following had proven equally consistent from the earliest cultivation of the Togrul relationship through the absorption of defeated Keriot and Naiman populations. The strategic intelligence that identified leverage points and opportunities had operated throughout, from the deployment of the Sablecoat to the timing of the Keriot campaign, while the resilience in adversity that had survived the Taichud captivity and the Dalan Balzut defeat had proven adequate to every subsequent challenge. These qualities would now be tested against opponents whose resources exceeded anything the steppe could mobilize, and whose civilizations had endured for centuries or millennia before the Mongols emerged from obscurity. But the pattern of success established during the unification period would prove remarkably consistent throughout the campaigns of expansion that followed. The consolidation of Mongol power in 1206 created a military machine of unprecedented capability, yet the new empire faced immediate practical challenges that demanded resolution before any significant expansion could commence. The steppe economy that had sustained Mongol life for generations operated on principles of subsistence pastoralism that could support raiding and seasonal warfare, but could not maintain the permanent military establishment that Genghis Khan now commanded. The unification itself had disrupted traditional economic patterns by ending the raiding and counter-raiding between Mongol groups that had historically redistributed wealth across the steppe, while the concentration of fighting men under central command removed labour from herding activities at precisely the moment when the new state required greater rather than lesser economic output. The solution to these pressures lay in the direction that steppe confederations had historically pursued when internal resources proved insufficient for internal demands, which was to extract wealth from the sedentary civilizations that bordered the grasslands through tribute, trade, or direct military appropriation. The particular genius of Mongol expansion lay not in the novelty of this approach, but in the scale and systematic nature of its implementation, combined with administrative innovations that allowed the empire to retain and utilize conquered resources rather than simply consuming them in immediate redistribution. The first major external campaign following the 1206 Kuriltai targeted the Xixia Kingdom, a Tangut state that controlled the strategically crucial corridor linking Mongolia to the trade routes of Central Asia and China proper. The Xixia had emerged in the early 11th century as Tangut tribes consolidated control over territories along the northwestern frontiers of the Chinese world, establishing a kingdom that combined elements of Tibetan, Chinese, and steppe culture into a distinctive synthesis capable of maintaining independence against both the Song dynasty to the south and various steppe powers to the north. The Tangut military tradition emphasized heavy cavalry and fortified positions, a combination that had proven effective against previous steppe incursions, but that would encounter unfamiliar challenges when confronted with Mongol tactical flexibility and strategic persistence. Genghis Khan's initial probes against Xixia beginning in 1205, even before the formal proclamation of his supreme title, served partly as training exercises for the newly unified Mongol forces and partly as resource extraction operations that brought back plunder to distribute among his followers, addressing the economic pressures created by unification while simultaneously demonstrating the opportunities that external expansion could provide. The full-scale invasion of Xixia commenced in 1209, when Mongol forces advanced against the fortified cities and agricultural settlements that represented the core of Tangut power. The challenges presented by sedentary warfare differed fundamentally from the steppe campaigns that had consumed the previous 2 decades, requiring adaptations in Mongol military practice that would prove essential for all subsequent imperial expansion. The walled cities of the Tangut kingdom could not be taken by the cavalry tactics that dominated open-field warfare. necessitating the development of siege capabilities that the Mongols initially lacked. The solution emerged through a combination of tactical innovation and the incorporation of expertise from conquered populations, as siege engineers, artisans, and military specialists from defeated territories were systematically absorbed into Mongol service, rather than being killed or enslaved in traditional patterns of steppe warfare. This practice of incorporating skilled individuals from conquered peoples would become a defining characteristic of Mongol expansion, transforming the empire from a purely steppe military force into a cosmopolitan enterprise that deployed Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, Uyghur scribes, and specialists drawn from every civilization the Mongols encountered. The Xixia campaign demonstrated both Mongol military capabilities and the practical challenges of confronting established states with developed defensive infrastructure. The siege of Zhongxing, the Tangut capital, required innovations including the attempted diversion of the Yellow River to flood the city's defences, a project that reportedly backfired when floodwaters inundated the Mongol camp rather than the intended target, but that nevertheless illustrated the willingness to experiment with techniques beyond traditional steppe warfare. The campaign ultimately succeeded through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic flexibility, as the Tangut ruler submitted to Mongol overlordship and agreed to provide tribute and military support for future campaigns, rather than continuing resistance to the point of complete destruction. This outcome established a pattern that would recur throughout early Mongol expansion, wherein adversaries who submitted promptly received relatively favourable terms, while those who resisted faced increasingly severe consequences, a graduated approach to conquest that created incentives for early capitulation and reduced the costs of imperial expansion. The submission of Xixia in 1210 freed Mongol forces for the campaign that would prove the first truly world historical engagement of Genghis Khan's career, the invasion of the Jin dynasty that controlled northern China and represented one of the wealthiest and most militarily powerful states in the contemporary world. The Jin had emerged from the Jurchen peoples of Manchuria, who had conquered northern China from the earlier Liao dynasty in the 12th century, and had established a sophisticated state combining Jurchen martial traditions with the administrative capabilities of Chinese civilization. The Jurchen elite constituted a ruling minority over a vast Chinese population, a demographic reality that created both the wealth and administrative sophistication that made the Jin formidable and the internal tensions that would eventually contribute to their collapse. The relationship between the Mongols and the Jin during Temujin's rise to power had fluctuated between nominal Mongol subordination, since the Jin claimed suzerainty over the steppe peoples to their north, and practical Mongol independence, since Jin power projection into the grasslands remained limited despite theoretical claims. The Jin had historically pursued policies of manipulating steppe politics to prevent the emergence of unified powers that might threaten their frontiers, supporting weaker groups against stronger ones and intervening to fragment any confederation that grew too powerful, policies that had contributed to the chaos of Temujin's early life, and that he had good reason to resent. The immediate occasion for the Mongol-Jin War arose from the succession of a new Jin emperor in 1208, and the expectation that Mongol leaders would acknowledge Jin suzerainty through appropriate diplomatic submissions. Genghis Khan's refusal to perform the expected obeisances constituted a formal declaration of independence from Jin overlordship and an implicit assertion that Mongol power now exceeded that of their former nominal sovereigns. The military campaign that followed, beginning in 1211, would continue intermittently for over 2 decades, and would result in the complete destruction of the Jin dynasty, though Genghis Khan himself would not live to see the final conquest. The scale of the Jin War exceeded anything the Mongols had previously undertaken, engaging a state with a population of approximately 50 million people, extensive fortifications developed over centuries of border defence, and military forces that included not only cavalry comparable to Mongol capabilities, but also sophisticated infantry, siege weapons, and naval forces that operated in environments entirely foreign to steppe experience. The initial Mongol campaigns against the Jin demonstrated both the remarkable effectiveness of steppe cavalry warfare and its limitations when confronting the defensive capabilities of Chinese civilization. Mongol forces could devastate the countryside, defeating Jin field armies in open battle through the superior mobility and tactical coordination that had proven decisive in the unification campaigns. But the walled cities that contained Jin administrative centres, military reserves, and accumulated wealth remained largely impervious to cavalry assault. The pattern that emerged involved systematic devastation of Jin territory outside fortified positions, destruction of agricultural capacity that undermined the economic foundations of Jin power, and gradual isolation of urban centres whose populations swelled with refugees while their support from surrounding territories disappeared. The human costs of this approach proved staggering, as populations caught between advancing Mongol forces and walled cities that could not accommodate them faced death from violence, starvation or disease on scales that contemporary observers struggle to comprehend. The demographic collapse of northern China during the Mongol conquest may have reduced populations by half or more in affected regions, transforming one of the most densely settled landscapes on Earth into depopulated wastelands that would require generations to recover. The Jin capital of Zhongdu, the city that would later become Beijing, fell to Mongol forces in 1215 after a prolonged siege that illustrated both Mongol military development and the desperate circumstances of Jin resistance. The fall of Zhongdu yielded enormous quantities of plunder that demonstrated to Mongol leaders the potential rewards of continuing conquest, while simultaneously providing resources for further campaigns. The capture also brought into Mongol service significant numbers of Chinese administrators, technicians, and military specialists whose expertise would prove essential for governing conquered territories and conducting subsequent operations. The figure of Yelu Shukai, a Khitan scholar official who had served the Jin dynasty before entering Genghis Khan's service, exemplified this incorporation of conquered expertise into imperial administration. Yelu Chukai would eventually play a crucial role in establishing Mongol administrative practices in Chinese territories, advocating for systematic taxation rather than simple plunder, and for the preservation of agricultural populations whose productivity could generate sustained revenue rather than one-time extraction. The Jin War continued after the fall of Zhongdu, as the remnants of Jin power retreated southward and established new defensive positions that would resist Mongol pressure for another 2 decades. However, Genghis Khan's attention increasingly turned westward during this period, drawn by a combination of strategic opportunity and personal grievance toward the Khwarezmian Empire that controlled Central Asia and the eastern reaches of the Islamic world. The Khwarezmian state had emerged relatively recently, consolidating power over the fragmented Islamic territories of Persia, Transoxiana and Afghanistan under Sultan Muhammad II, who by 1218 ruled over wealthy cities including Samarkand, Bukhara, and the ancient trading centres of the Silk Road. The commercial connections between the Mongol territories and the Khwarezmian Empire had developed alongside military expansion, with merchants carrying luxury goods, intelligence, and diplomatic communications along routes that had linked the steppe to the settled civilizations of Western Asia for millennia. The incident that precipitated the Mongol-Khwarezmian War occurred at Otrar, a frontier city where the governor ordered the execution of a Mongol commercial and diplomatic mission in 1218, apparently suspecting the merchants of espionage and coveting the valuable goods they carried. The subsequent execution of an envoy sent by Genghis Khan to demand redress removed any possibility of diplomatic resolution and provided the Khan with grounds for military action that combined strategic calculation with genuine rage at the violation of diplomatic immunity. The Mongol response to the Otrar incident would prove one of the most destructive military campaigns in human history, resulting in the effective elimination of Khwarezmian power, the devastation of cities that had flourished for centuries, and population losses across Central Asia and Persia that fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of the Islamic world. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire beginning in 1219 demonstrated Mongol military capabilities at their most formidable, as forces numbering perhaps 100,000 warriors advanced against a state that possessed significantly larger armies, but that proved incapable of coordinating effective resistance. Sultan Muhammad's strategic decision to disperse his forces among fortified cities, rather than concentrating them for field battle, reflected reasonable calculations about the difficulty of defeating Mongol cavalry in open warfare, but proved catastrophic in practice when Mongol coordination and mobility allowed them to isolate and reduce these garrisons individually. The pattern of siege and destruction that had developed during the Jin campaign was applied with even greater intensity against Khwarezmian cities, as urban centres that resisted faced complete annihilation, while those that submitted promptly sometimes received relatively favourable treatment. The graduated approach to conquest that had emerged during earlier campaigns reached its fullest development during the Khwarezmian War, creating incentives for early surrender that accelerated Mongol advances while making examples of resistant cities that served as warnings to others. The fall of Bukhara in 1220 illustrated both the psychological warfare that accompanied Mongol military operations and the systematic efficiency of their approach to conquest. Genghis Khan reportedly assembled the population of the city in the Great Mosque, where he delivered an address presenting himself as the instrument of divine punishment for the sins of the conquered and warning of the consequences of continued resistance. The extraction of wealth from Bukhara proceeded through organised requisition rather than uncontrolled looting, as Mongol officials systematically catalogued and removed valuables, while artisans, engineers and other skilled individuals were separated from the general population for incorporation into imperial service. The city itself was largely destroyed following the removal of useful resources and personnel, leaving behind ruins that would take decades to rebuild, and that served as visible evidence of Mongol power for subsequent generations. Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asian civilization and one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, fell shortly after Bukhara under circumstances that demonstrated the rapid collapse of Khwarezmian military resistance. The city's garrison attempted a sortie against Mongol forces that resulted in catastrophic defeat, after which the remaining defenders and civilian population faced the full consequences of unsuccessful resistance. The treatment of Samarkand's population followed the established pattern of separating skilled individuals for preservation, while subjecting the remainder to various fates ranging from forced labour to mass execution depending on circumstances and Mongol perceptions of their potential utility or threat. The destruction visited upon Samarkand, while severe, fell short of complete annihilation, as the city's commercial importance made its eventual recovery strategically valuable, but the immediate impact devastated a cultural and economic centre that had flourished under various rulers for over 2,000 years. The pursuit of Sultan Muhammad following the fall of his major cities demonstrated Mongol strategic vision, operating at continental scale, as detachments under the generals Jebe and Sube'etei were dispatched to chase the fleeing sultan across Persia, while the main Mongol forces continued systematic reduction of Khwarezmian territories. This pursuit became one of the most remarkable cavalry operations in military history, as the Mongol force crossed Persia, penetrated the Caucasus Mountains, and emerged onto the Russian steppe in what began as a manhunt and evolved into a reconnaissance in force that would shape Mongol strategic planning for subsequent decades. Sultan Muhammad died on an island in the Caspian Sea in late 1220, probably from pneumonia, though the stress of his total defeat certainly contributed to his demise, ending a reign that had seemed to establish Khwarezmian dominance over the Eastern Islamic world, but that crumbled within 2 years of Mongol contact. The campaigns against Khwarezmian resistance continued even after Muhammad's death, as his son Jalal ad-Din organised desperate defence in Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush region that inflicted the first significant battlefield defeat on Mongol forces at the Battle of Parwan in 1221. This victory proved temporary, as Genghis Khan personally led reinforcements that cornered Jalal ad-Din at the Indus River, where the Khwarezmian prince escaped by swimming the river on horseback, but lost the army and treasury that might have sustained continued resistance. The pursuit of Jalal ad-Din demonstrated Mongol persistence in eliminating threats, though the prince would survive as a fugitive for another decade before meeting death at the hands of Kurdish tribesmen rather than Mongol executioners. The destruction of the Khwarezmian state was completed by 1223, leaving the territories from the Syr Darya to the Persian Gulf under Mongol control and eliminating the major power that had blocked steppe access to the wealth of the Islamic world. The Caucasus campaign of Jebe and Sube'etei extended Mongol military operations into regions entirely beyond previous steppe experience, demonstrating the adaptability that characterized imperial expansion at every stage. The Mongol force crossed mountains that should have been impassable for cavalry armies, utilizing local guides and applying the combination of ruthlessness and flexibility that had proven effective across vastly different environments. The encounters with Georgian, Armenian, and various Caucasian peoples introduced the Mongols to Christian civilizations whose existence had previously been unknown to them, just as these populations confronted for the first time the military phenomenon that would reshape their worlds. The emergence of Mongol forces onto the Pontic, steppe north of the Caucasus, brought them into contact with the Kipchak Turks and the Russian principalities that would become primary targets of subsequent Western campaigns. The Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 provided the first engagement between Mongol forces and the combined armies of the Russian principalities, establishing patterns that would characterize subsequent interactions between the steppe empire and the Slavic world. The Russian princes, alerted to the Mongol threat by their Kipchak allies, assembled a coalition army that vastly outnumbered the Mongol force, but that lacked the coordination and tactical discipline necessary for effective resistance. The Mongol commanders employed the feigned retreat that had proven effective across Asia, drawing the Russian cavalry into pursuit that separated them from their infantry supports, and exposed them to the coordinated counterattack that destroyed the pursuing forces in detail. The aftermath of the Kalka River battle included the execution of captured Russian princes through suffocation beneath boards on which the Mongol commanders held a victory feast, a method that avoided spilling royal blood while disposing of enemies whose survival might have complicated future operations. The reconnaissance force under Yebian Subedai completed its circuit of the Caspian Sea by returning eastward through the steppe territories north of that inland ocean, rejoining Genghis Khan's main forces after a journey that had covered thousands of miles and gathered intelligence about populations, resources and military capabilities that would inform Mongol strategic planning for the campaigns of the following generation. The expedition demonstrated that Mongol cavalry operations could be sustained across distances that exceeded anything previously achieved by steppe military forces, while the victories over Georgian, Armenian, Kipchak and Russian forces established that Western armies presented no greater challenge than the opponents already defeated across Asia. The death of Jebe during the return journey deprived the Mongol military establishment of one of its most capable commanders, though Subedai survived to become the principal architect of the Western campaigns that would bring Mongol power to the borders of Central Europe within 2 decades. The return of Genghis Khan to Mongolia in 1225 marked the transition from active expansion to the consolidation of an empire whose territories already exceeded anything previously created by nomadic conquest. The Khan was approaching 60 years of age, having spent most of his adult life in continuous military campaigns that had transformed a fragmented collection of steppe tribes into the dominant power across the Asian continent. The administrative structures established during the years of conquest required attention and refinement, as the governance of settled populations presented challenges fundamentally different from the management of nomadic confederations, whose loyalty derived from personal bonds and shared military success. The yasa that Genghis Khan had promulgated as the law of the Mongol state applied primarily to the nomadic population, establishing the harsh penalties and rigid social discipline that maintained cohesion among the tribes while leaving the administration of conquered territories to local systems modified only enough to ensure revenue collection and military cooperation. The distribution of conquered territories among Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons during this period established the political geography that would shape Mongol affairs for the remainder of the century and beyond. The concept of appanages, territorial assignments that provided income and subjects while theoretically remaining subordinate to the authority of the Great Khan, attempted to balance the centrifugal tendencies of a sprawling empire against the centripetal requirements of unified command and coordinated policy. The eldest son Yochi had received the Western Territories, those lands farthest from the Mongol heartland that would eventually become the realm of the Golden Horde, though Yochi's death in 1227 transferred these assignments to his sons Batu and Orda, whose descendants would rule the Western steppe for centuries. The second son, Chagatai, received the territories of Central Asia, the former Karakitai and Khwarezmian domains, whose Turkic and Persian populations would eventually absorb their Mongol rulers into Islamic civilization. The third son, Nyogadei, received territories in the Dzunga region and the former Jin borderlands, positioning him as the heir most closely connected to the Mongol heartland, while also establishing his claim to the succession that Genghis Khan had determined should pass to this third son, rather than following strict primogeniture. The youngest son, Tolui, received the Mongol homeland itself, following the steppe tradition that assigned the heartland territories to the youngest son, while older brothers received frontier assignments that carried both opportunity and obligation. The final campaign of Genghis Khan's life returned to the Tangut kingdom of Shishya, whose rulers had failed to provide the military support required during the Khwarezmian War, and whose elimination represented unfinished business from the earlier phase of Mongol expansion. The Tangut state had survived the initial Mongol campaigns of the 1200s and early 1210s through submission and tributary payments, but the refusal to contribute forces to the Western campaign constituted betrayal that demanded comprehensive punishment rather than renewed negotiation. The campaign launched in 1226 employed the systematic approach developed against the Jin and Khwarezmian empires, though the territories involved were considerably smaller and the resistance correspondingly limited. The siege of Tangut cities proceeded according to established patterns, with civilian populations suffering the consequences of their rulers' decisions through massacres that eliminated potential resistance, while demonstrating the costs of defiance to observers throughout the region. The death of Genghis Khan occurred during this campaign, probably in August 1227, though the exact circumstances remain deliberately obscured by Mongol sources that sought to preserve the Khan's dignity while acknowledging the mortality that even the greatest conqueror could not escape. Various accounts attributed his death to illness, to injuries sustained in hunting, or to complications from a fall from his horse, though the consistent element across sources is that the Khan knew death was approaching and made arrangements for succession and the continuation of operations against the Tanguts. The instructions that Genghis Khan provided regarding the completion of the Tangut campaign and the conduct of succession proceedings demonstrated the strategic clarity that had characterized his leadership throughout decades of expansion. The Tangut kingdom was to be utterly destroyed, its ruling house eliminated, and its population punished with particular severity for the betrayal that had prompted the final campaign. The succession was to pass to Ögedei, whose installation as Great Khan required the agreement of a Kurultai gathering all major figures of the Mongol establishment, though Genghis Khan's expressed preference carried sufficient authority to ensure compliance from his sons and commanders. The maintenance of secrecy regarding the Khan's death until the Tangut campaign was completed reflected concern that news of his passing might encourage resistance among enemies, or ambition among subordinates whose loyalty depended on personal connection to the deceased ruler. The body of Genghis Khan was transported to Mongolia for burial in a location that remains unknown, deliberately concealed according to traditions that sought to prevent disturbance of the remains, while maintaining the mystique surrounding the founder, whose accomplishments exceeded anything in Mongol historical memory. The reign of Ögedei Khan, formally inaugurated in 1229 following the Kurultai that confirmed his succession, represented continuation and expansion of the imperial project rather than fundamental transformation of methods or objectives. The new Khan possessed administrative talents that complemented his father's military genius, overseeing the construction of Karakorum as a permanent capital that provided the empire with an administrative centre appropriate to its scale, while the continuation of military campaigns extended Mongol authority across remaining unconquered territories. The establishment of Karakorum reflected the evolution of Mongol governance from purely nomadic patterns toward the hybrid systems that would characterize the mature empire, as the capital incorporated elements from Chinese, Central Asian, and Persian administrative traditions while maintaining the steppe character that distinguished Mongol rule from the sedentary empires it had conquered. The city attracted merchants, artisans, religious figures, and diplomatic missions from across Eurasia, creating a cosmopolitan environment that reflected the continental scope of Mongol power, while providing the Khan with access to expertise and information necessary for effective imperial administration. The continuation of the Jin campaign under Ögedei brought to completion the destruction of the dynasty that had dominated northern China for a century, eliminating the final significant obstacle to Mongol control of the Chinese heartland while establishing precedents for the governance of conquered Chinese populations. The alliance with the Song dynasty of southern China, maintained through the Jin Wars despite the obvious implications for Song security once Jin resistance collapsed, provided the military coordination and regional knowledge that facilitated final operations against Jin holdouts. The capture of Kaifeng in 1233 and the suicide of the last Jin emperor in 1234 completed the campaign that Genghis Khan had initiated 2 decades earlier, transferring to Mongol control the territories and populations that constituted one of the wealthiest regions of the medieval world. The incorporation of Jin administrative personnel and systems into Mongol governance demonstrated the pragmatic approach that characterized imperial expansion, as conquered bureaucrats found continued employment under new masters whose martial prowess was matched by recognition that the governance of agricultural societies required expertise that nomadic backgrounds did not provide. The relationship between the Mongol conquerors and the Chinese populations they now ruled established patterns that would evolve throughout the century as different approaches competed for imperial favour. The harsh exploitation that characterized initial conquest gradually moderated as Mongol authorities recognized that dead peasants produced no revenue and destroyed irrigation systems could not be quickly restored. The category systems that classified populations according to origin created hierarchies in which Mongols occupied the highest positions, with Central Asian auxiliaries below them, Northern Chinese below them, and Southern Chinese populations eventually assigned to the lowest category when Song territories came under Mongol control. These classifications affected taxation rates, legal status, and access to official positions, creating social structures that reflected conquest realities while generating the resentments that would eventually contribute to Mongol collapse. The employment of non-Chinese administrators in Chinese territories, particularly Central Asians whose merchant backgrounds provided useful skills, while their foreign origins prevented dangerous identification with subject populations, represented deliberate policy designed to maintain distinctions between rulers and ruled that nomadic traditions considered essential for the preservation of martial vigour. The Western campaigns of the 1230s and 1240s extended Mongol power into territories that Genghis Khan's reconnaissance forces had explored but not conquered, bringing the steppe empire into direct contact with European civilization, while demonstrating that the military superiority established against Asian opponents applied equally to the armies of Christendom. The campaign that began in 1236 under the overall command of Batu Khan, son of the deceased Jochi and inheritor of the Western Appanage, employed forces drawn from across the empire in numbers that overwhelmed all resistance, while the coordinated strategic planning reflected the accumulated experience of 3 decades of continuous expansion. The conquest of the Volga Bulgars and the various peoples of the Russian forest zone proceeded according to established methods, with cities destroyed and populations massacred or enslaved, while the speed of Mongol movement prevented effective coordination among defenders whose political fragmentation facilitated piecemeal destruction. The fall of the Russian principalities during the winter campaign of 1237 to 1238 demonstrated Mongol willingness to conduct operations during seasons that European military convention considered unsuitable for warfare, utilizing frozen rivers as highways that facilitated cavalry movement, while the harsh conditions added to the misery of populations unable to organize effective defense. The city of Ryazan fell in December 1237 after 5 days of siege, its population massacred and its prince executed as an example to neighbours whose submission might reduce the casualties their own populations would suffer. The fall of Vladimir, Moscow, and other cities of the Vladimir-Suzdal region followed during the subsequent months, each conquest adding to the destruction that characterized Mongol operations against populations identified as having resisted rather than submitted. The death of Grand Prince Yuri at the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238 eliminated the most significant leader of the northeastern Russian principalities, though the approaching spring thaw and the accumulating casualties forced the Mongol forces to pause before completing the conquest of the entire Russian territory. The resumption of Western operations in 1240 completed the destruction of the major Russian principalities and carried Mongol power into Central Europe proper, where the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland discovered that their military establishments offered no more effective resistance than the forces already destroyed across Asia. The fall of Kiev in December 1240 eliminated the symbolic centre of Russian civilization, as the city that had once served as capital of the Kievan Rus was reduced to a town of 200 houses following massacres and deportations that transformed one of Europe's great cities into a depopulated ruin. The destruction of Kiev's churches and palaces, accumulated over 3 centuries of Russian Christian civilization, demonstrated Mongol indifference to cultural achievements, whose preservation might have served alternative approaches to imperial governance. The envoy from Pope Innocent IV, who visited Kiev several years after its destruction, reported finding countless skulls and bones scattered across the landscape, providing Western Christendom with eyewitness testimony of the devastation that Mongol conquest imposed upon the populations it encountered. The campaign into Poland and Hungary during 1241 represented the furthest western extension of Mongol military power, demonstrating capabilities that terrified European observers while revealing the limits of what even Mongol armies could achieve against the distances and populations of the European continent. The division of Mongol forces into multiple columns that conducted coordinated operations across hundreds of miles of hostile territory reflected the sophisticated command and communication systems that had evolved through decades of expansion. as the various formations maintained contact and achieved mutual support despite operating in unfamiliar terrain against opponents whose military practices differed significantly from Asian precedents. The Battle of Legnica in April 1241 destroyed a Polish army that included the flower of Polish chivalry, along with contingents from the military orders whose presence demonstrated European awareness that exceptional resistance was required against the invading forces. The armoured knights who had dominated European warfare for centuries discovered that their tactical methods were ineffective against opponents whose mobility, discipline and coordinated tactics exposed the weaknesses that European military establishments had never been required to address. The Battle of Mohy, fought 2 days after Legnica against the Hungarian army of King Bela IV, provided even more devastating demonstration of Mongol military superiority as the combined forces of the Hungarian kingdom were destroyed in a single engagement that left the country defenceless against subsequent Mongol operations. The Hungarian army possessed significant numerical strength and included the armoured cavalry that European military theory considered the decisive arm of medieval warfare. Yet the coordination of Mongol combined arms operations, the discipline that maintained formation through hours of engagement, and the tactical flexibility that adapted to battlefield conditions all contributed to a victory that eliminated effective Hungarian resistance. The pursuit following the battle demonstrated Mongol thoroughness in exploiting success, as scattered Hungarian forces were hunted across the kingdom, while King Bela fled through Croatia toward the Adriatic coast. The occupation of Hungary during the following year subjected the Hungarian population to the systematic exploitation that characterized Mongol administration of conquered territories, as agricultural production was taxed, populations were counted, and preparations began for the permanent incorporation of the Hungarian lands into the western appanage of the Mongol Empire. The withdrawal of Mongol forces from Hungary in 1242 reflected strategic considerations rather than military necessity, as the news of Ögedei Khan's death in December 1241 created political requirements that took precedence over the completion of European conquest. The succession to the position of Great Khan required the participation of senior princes and commanders in the Kurultai that would determine the future leadership of the empire, making continued operations in distant Hungary less important than a presence at deliberations that would shape the political landscape of the Mongol world. The question of whether Mongol forces would have continued westward had Ögedei lived remains unanswerable, though the logistical challenges of sustaining cavalry operations in the increasingly forested and fortified terrain of Western Europe would have presented difficulties that the Hungarian campaign had not yet required the Mongol forces to address. The withdrawal demonstrated that Mongol expansion, however devastating in its immediate effects, remained subject to political constraints that could override military momentum when circumstances required the redirection of attention and resources toward internal imperial affairs. The succession struggles that followed Ögedei's death introduced periods of instability that would increasingly characterize Mongol imperial politics, as the competing claims of different lineages and the ambitions of powerful regents created factions whose conflicts diverted energy from external expansion toward internal competition. The regency of Turagena, Ögedei's widow, exercised effective power for 5 years, while manoeuvring to ensure that her son Gyuk would eventually secure the succession against rivals whose claims reflected the complex politics of Genghis Khan's family arrangements. The installation of Gyuk as Great Khan in 1246 resolved the immediate succession crisis, while creating new tensions with the descendants of Jochi, whose western territories placed them at considerable remove from the Mongol heartland, and whose interests increasingly diverged from those of lineages more closely connected to the centre of imperial power. The brief reign of Gyuk, who died in 1248 after only 2 years as Great Khan, prevented the resolution of these tensions while creating additional succession complications that further fragmented the imperial unity that Genghis Khan's personal authority had maintained. The elevation of Mungke Khan in 1251 represented the transfer of supreme authority from the Ögedei line to the descendants of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son whose family had remained most closely connected to the Mongol heartland, and whose military capabilities had proven essential throughout the decades of expansion. The Kurultai that installed Mungke followed purges that eliminated potential rivals and their supporters, establishing precedents for violent succession politics that would characterize subsequent transitions while demonstrating that the unity of the Mongol Empire depended on the ability of particular rulers to suppress opposition rather than on institutional mechanisms capable of managing peaceful transitions. The reign of Münke initiated new phases of expansion in both eastern and western directions, as the campaigns against Song China and the remaining independent territories of the Middle East resumed with the vigour that had characterised the era of initial conquest, while the internal consolidation of imperial authority proceeded through administrative reforms designed to address the inefficiencies that had developed during the periods of regency and succession conflict. The campaigns that Münke Khan authorised against the remaining centres of Islamic power in the Middle East represented the culmination of strategic ambitions that had developed since the initial Mongol incursions into the region during the reign of Genghis Khan himself. The Abbasid Caliphate centred at Baghdad had survived the earlier Mongol campaigns that had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire and reduced the principalities of Persia to tributary status, maintaining its nominal position as the spiritual centre of Sunni Islam, while exercising effective political authority over the fertile territories of Mesopotamia that had constituted one of the wealthiest and most culturally significant regions of the medieval world. The caliph's position combined religious authority with territorial power in ways that made Baghdad simultaneously a political target and a symbolic prize whose capture would announce Mongol supremacy over the Islamic world with unmistakable clarity to observers throughout the broader region. The assignment of this campaign to Hulagu, Münke's younger brother, reflected the practice of entrusting major expansionary operations to members of the ruling family, whose success would enhance both imperial prestige and dynastic authority, while providing territorial foundations for the new branches of the Genghisid lineage that continued to emerge with each generation. The forces assembled for the campaign against Baghdad and the subsequent operations against remaining centres of resistance constituted one of the largest Mongol armies deployed since the initial conquests under Genghis Khan, incorporating contingents from across the empire whose mobilization demonstrated the continued capacity of Mongol administrative systems to coordinate military resources across vast territorial expanses. The army that marched westward from the Iranian plateau in 1257 included not only the Mongol cavalry that had proven so devastating against previous opponents, but also substantial numbers of Chinese siege engineers, whose expertise in the construction and operation of advanced siege equipment would prove essential against the fortified cities that constituted the defensive system of the caliphate. The specialized knowledge that these engineers brought to the campaign reflected the technological transfers that Mongol conquest had facilitated, as techniques developed in one region of the empire became available for application in entirely different contexts through the movement of skilled practitioners who served imperial purposes wherever their abilities might prove useful. The approach to Baghdad demonstrated the methodical preparation that characterized major Mongol operations, as the systematic reduction of outlying fortifications and the neutralization of potential relief forces preceded the investment of the capital itself, while diplomatic communications offered the caliph opportunities for submission that would have preserved his life and some measure of his authority in exchange for recognition of Mongol supremacy. The refusal of Caliph al-Mustasim to submit to Mongol demands reflected either confidence in the strength of his defences or miscalculation regarding Mongol capabilities, though the subsequent course of events would demonstrate that neither the walls of Baghdad nor the army available for its defence could withstand the concentrated power that Hulagu had assembled for the campaign. The siege of Baghdad in January and February of 1258 applied the techniques that Mongol forces had perfected across decades of urban warfare in China, Central Asia, and Persia, as siege lines isolated the city from external assistance while bombardment from catapults and other siege engines progressively degraded the defensive fortifications that protected the caliphal capital. The breaching of the walls created conditions for the assault that followed, as Mongol forces entered a city whose population had swelled with refugees from the surrounding countryside, and whose defenders had proven incapable of preventing the systematic destruction of the fortifications upon which the security of Baghdad had depended. The sack of Baghdad that followed the Mongol entry continued for approximately 1 week, during which the accumulated wealth of centuries was plundered. The population was subjected to massacre, and the physical infrastructure of the city was substantially destroyed through the combination of deliberate demolition and uncontrolled fires that accompanied the violence of the conquest. The execution of Caliph al-Mustasim following the fall of Baghdad marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a functioning political institution, terminating a dynasty whose origins extended back to the 8th century, and whose historical significance encompassed the cultural and intellectual achievements of the classical Islamic civilization that had flourished under caliphal patronage during earlier centuries of greater power and prosperity. The manner of the caliph's death, reportedly by being rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses to avoid the shedding of royal blood upon the ground, reflected Mongol beliefs regarding the spiritual dangers associated with such bloodshed, while demonstrating the completeness of the caliphate's destruction through the elimination of its last representative. The death of the caliph and the destruction of Baghdad removed the most significant remaining centre of independent Islamic political authority in the eastern portions of the Muslim world, reducing the formerly vast territories of the caliphate to the status of Mongol possessions, whose administration would proceed according to the systems that Mongol governors had developed for the management of conquered populations across the empire. The destruction was sufficiently comprehensive that the irrigation systems upon which Mesopotamian agricultural productivity depended suffered damage that would require centuries to repair, transforming one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world into territories whose economic capacity had been permanently diminished by the violence of conquest. The continuation of Mongol operations westward following the conquest of Baghdad carried the campaigns into Syria, where the remnants of the Ayyubid dynasty that Saladin had established still controlled territories that included major cities, whose commercial and strategic significance made them natural targets for continued expansion. The capture of Aleppo and Damascus in 1260 extended Mongol authority to the shores of the Mediterranean, while reducing the remaining Muslim principalities of Syria to ruins that testified to the devastating effectiveness of Mongol military methods when applied against opponents who lacked either the military capabilities or the political unity necessary for effective resistance. The advance of Mongol forces toward Egypt created the possibility of further expansion that would have placed the entire Middle East under Mongol control, while eliminating the Mamluk Sultanate that had recently established itself in Egypt through the overthrow of the Ayyubid rulers who had governed that wealthy territory since the era of Saladin. The Mamluk state that faced this Mongol threat represented a distinctive political system based on the military slavery that had characterized Egyptian governance for several generations, as purchased slaves from the Turkic peoples of the Eurasian steppes were trained as elite cavalry whose military skills had proven capable of defending Egypt against previous threats, while eventually enabling them to seize power for themselves. The Battle of Ain Jalut in September 1260 represented a turning point in the history of Mongol expansion, as the Mamluk forces under the command of Sultan Qutuz inflicted the first significant defeat that a Mongol army had suffered in nearly half a century of continuous military operations across the breadth of Eurasia. The Mongol force that faced the Mamluks at Ain Jalut was substantially smaller than the armies that had conquered Baghdad and swept through Syria during the preceding campaigns, as Hulagu had withdrawn the bulk of his forces eastward in response to news of Mongol Khan's death during the siege of a Song fortress in China, leaving only a relatively modest detachment under the command of Kitbuka Noyan to maintain Mongol authority in the newly conquered Syrian territories. The circumstances that produced this reduction in Mongol strength reflected the same pattern that had ended the European campaigns nearly 2 decades earlier, as the death of the great Khan created political requirements that took precedence over the continuation of distant military operations regardless of their strategic promise. The Mamluk victory demonstrated that Mongol armies, when caught in unfavourable circumstances and deprived of their customary numerical and qualitative advantages, could be defeated by opponents whose cavalry traditions provided them with military capabilities roughly comparable to those that the Mongols themselves possessed. The aftermath of Ain Jalut established patterns that would characterize the relationships between the Mongol successor states and their neighbors for the following decades, as the Mamluks consolidated their control over Syria, while the Ilkhanate that Hulagu established in Persia and Mesopotamia found itself unable to reverse the defeat or to complete the conquest of the Middle East that had seemed within reach before the setback at Ain Jalut. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 initiated another succession crisis that proved more destructive to imperial unity than either of the previous transitions, as competing claims to the position of Great Khan produced civil conflict between different branches of the Genghisid lineage, whose resolution would permanently fragment the unity of the Mongol Empire into effectively independent successor states, whose relationships would be characterized by competition and occasional warfare rather than by the coordinated cooperation that had enabled the conquests of the earlier period. The contest between Kublai and Arikberke for succession to the position of Great Khan occupied the attention and resources of the eastern portions of the empire for several years, as the brothers mobilized their respective supporters for military confrontations whose outcomes would determine the future leadership of the Mongol world, while simultaneously weakening the central authority upon which imperial unity had depended. The victory of Kublai Khan in the succession struggle established his supremacy within the eastern portions of the empire, while simultaneously accelerating the fragmentation that had already begun to characterize relationships between the major divisions of Mongol territory that had developed since the time of Genghis Khan. The Golden Horde controlling the western steppes from its centre at Sarai on the lower Volga, the Chagatai Khanate dominating Central Asia from its territories astride the traditional trade routes of the Silk Road, and the Ilkhanate governing Persia and Mesopotamia from capitals at Tabriz and later Sultania, each increasingly operated as independent political entities, whose recognition of the Great Khan's nominal supremacy became progressively more ceremonial and less substantive as the decades passed. The conquests of the earlier period had created territorial foundations whose management required autonomous administrative systems that naturally developed their own interests and priorities, while the geographic distances separating the major divisions of the empire made effective central coordination increasingly difficult, even when the political will for such coordination existed among the various ruling houses. The emergence of these effectively independent Khanates represented both the success and the limitations of Mongol imperial achievement, as the territories conquered through unified effort proved too vast and diverse to be maintained under genuine central authority once the extraordinary circumstances of the initial conquest had passed, and the empire entered phases of consolidation that required administrative systems adequate to the governance of settled populations across enormously varied environmental and cultural landscapes. The reign of Kublai Khan represented both the culmination and the transformation of Mongol imperial ambitions, as the grandson of Genghis Khan completed the conquest of Song China while simultaneously establishing patterns of governance that marked significant departures from the nomadic traditions that had characterized earlier phases of Mongol rule. The campaign against the Song dynasty that Mungke Khan had initiated continued under Kublai's direction, following his consolidation of power in the succession struggle, as Mongol forces systematically reduced the remaining centres of Song resistance through campaigns that combined military pressure with diplomatic initiatives designed to encourage surrender by demonstrating both the futility of continued resistance and the benefits available to those who submitted to Mongol authority. The conquest of South China required more than a decade of sustained military effort, as the technological sophistication of Song defences and the challenging terrain of the southern regions presented obstacles that demanded the adaptation of Mongol methods to circumstances quite different from the open steppes and arid plateaus where their cavalry had achieved its most dramatic successes. The capture of the Song capital at Hangzhou in 1276 and the final destruction of Song resistance at the naval battle of Yarmen in 1279 completed the unification of China under Mongol rule, creating the Yuan dynasty whose territories encompassed the entire Chinese civilization for the first time under non-Chinese rulership since the centuries before the Tang dynasty had established Chinese imperial traditions in their classical form. The establishment of Mongol rule over China required the development of administrative systems capable of governing the most populous and economically sophisticated society in the contemporary world, creating challenges that the relatively simple systems adequate for the management of pastoral nomads and the extraction of tribute from conquered towns could not address. The administrative structures that Kublai Khan developed for the governance of Yuan China drew upon Chinese bureaucratic traditions, while maintaining the privileged position of Mongols and other non-Chinese peoples within the governmental hierarchy, creating a system of ethnic stratification that placed Mongols at the apex of authority while relegating the native Chinese population to subordinate positions whose exclusion from the highest offices reflected Mongol concerns about maintaining control over a population that vastly outnumbered its conquerors. The recruitment of administrators from across the broader Mongol Empire brought Central Asians, Persians, and even some Europeans into positions of responsibility within the Yuan government, creating cosmopolitan administrative cadres whose diverse origins reflected the transnational character of the Mongol imperial system, while simultaneously arousing the resentment of educated Chinese, whose traditional expectations of bureaucratic careers were frustrated by the foreign monopolization of governmental authority. The construction of Khanbalik, known to later generations as Beijing, as the capital of the Yuan dynasty, represented the architectural embodiment of Mongol imperial ambitions, as the new city that Kublai ordered, built on the site of the destroyed Jin capital, provided a centre of governmental authority adequate to the administration of territories that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the frontiers of Central Asia and from the Mongolian steppes to the subtropical coasts of southern China. The scale and grandeur of Kanbalik impressed visitors from across the known world, as the diplomatic missions, commercial representatives, and curious travellers who made their way to the Mongol capital encountered an urban centre whose population, wealth, and administrative sophistication exceeded anything available in the European or Islamic worlds of the contemporary period. The account of Marco Polo, whose extended residence at Kublai's court provided material for descriptions that would shape European understanding of East Asia for centuries, captured something of the wonder that the Yuan capital inspired in visitors accustomed to the smaller scale and more limited resources of medieval European urbanism. The palace complex at the heart of Kanbalik provided both the administrative headquarters and the ceremonial centre of Yuan governance, combining Chinese architectural traditions with adaptations that reflected Mongol preferences for movable felt tents that maintained connections to nomadic traditions, even as permanent structures housed the functions of settled imperial government. The maritime expeditions that Kublai Khan launched against Japan represented attempts to extend Mongol authority to territories that had remained beyond the reach of earlier conquest, while demonstrating the limitations that naval warfare imposed on military systems designed for continental operations. The invasion attempts of 1274 and 1281 both ended in failure, as typhoons that Japanese tradition would remember as kamikaze or divine winds destroyed substantial portions of the invasion fleets, while Japanese defenders successfully resisted the forces that managed to establish footholds on the Japanese islands. The destruction of the invasion fleets represented unprecedented setbacks for Mongol military operations, as the combination of Japanese resistance and natural disaster produced casualties and material losses that could not be recovered through the usual Mongol methods of exploitation and requisition. The failure of the Japan expeditions demonstrated that Mongol military capabilities, however formidable against continental opponents, could not guarantee success against island territories whose defence benefited from the natural barrier of surrounding seas and whose conquest required naval expertise that Mongol tradition had not developed through the generations of steppe warfare that had shaped their military systems. The expeditions that Kublai dispatched towards Southeast Asia during the later decades of his reign reflected continued ambitions for expansion, while encountering limitations similar to those that had frustrated the Japan campaigns, as tropical environments, unfamiliar diseases, and logistical challenges associated with operations far from the Mongol heartland combined to prevent the permanent conquest of territories whose distance from effective Mongol power projection made lasting occupation impractical. The campaigns against Burma, Vietnam, and Java achieved various degrees of temporary success, while consistently failing to establish permanent Mongol authority over territories whose environmental conditions and defensive capabilities presented challenges that the standard Mongol operational methods could not readily overcome. The tribute relationships that these campaigns sometimes established provided symbolic acknowledgement of Mongol supremacy without the substantive political control that characterized Mongol governance in territories where permanent military presence could be maintained, creating patterns of nominal submission that satisfied ceremonial requirements while leaving effective authority in the hands of local rulers whose practical independence continued despite their formal acknowledgement of UN overlordship. The economic policies that characterized UN governance reflected the combination of extraction and facilitation that had marked Mongol imperial administration since the earliest conquests, as the taxation of productive activities generated revenues that supported the military and administrative apparatus of the empire, while the protection of trade routes and commercial networks enabled the economic exchanges that produced taxable wealth. The continuation and expansion of the systems of paper currency that Chinese governments had pioneered under earlier dynasties facilitated commercial transactions across the vast territories of the Yuan realm, while creating monetary instruments whose acceptance depended upon governmental authority, and whose value could be undermined by excessive issuance that exceeded the productive capacity of the economy to absorb. The administrative innovations that UN governance introduced included experiments with monopolies over essential commodities, standardized systems of corvée labour that mobilized population for imperial construction projects, and census mechanisms that enabled more systematic taxation than earlier Mongol administrations had achieved through their reliance on less formalized methods of tribute extraction and resource appropriation. The death of Kublai Khan in 1294 at the age of 79 marked the passing of the last great Khan who had personally experienced the conquest that had created the Mongol Empire, and who had maintained even nominal authority over the fragmented successor states that now governed the territories once unified under Genghis Khan's descendants. The decades that followed Kublai's death witnessed the progressive weakening of Yuan authority within China itself, as the administrative structures that had enabled Mongol governance over the vast Chinese population encountered mounting challenges from economic disruption, natural disasters, and the accumulated resentments of populations whose submission to foreign rule had never reflected genuine acceptance of Mongol legitimacy. The succession disputes that had plagued earlier transitions of power within the Mongol imperial system continued to destabilize Yuan governance, as competing claimants to the Great Khan's position mobilized factional support among the Mongol aristocracy, while Chinese populations observed the spectacle of their rulers consumed by internal conflicts that diverted attention and resources from the challenges of effective administration. The emperors who followed Kublai Khan proved unable to maintain the combination of military capability, administrative competence, and personal authority that had enabled their predecessor to govern the vast Yuan realm, as shorter reigns, contested successions, and the declining martial qualities of rulers increasingly removed from the steppe traditions that had shaped earlier generations of Mongol leadership, all contributed to the progressive erosion of effective imperial control. The economic difficulties that mounted during the 14th century reflected both the inherent challenges of governing a monetary economy of unprecedented scale and the particular vulnerabilities that Yuan administrative policies had created through their reliance on paper currency systems, whose stability depended upon governmental restraint in the issuance of new notes. The inflation that resulted from excessive currency production undermined the commercial systems that had enabled Yuan prosperity, while generating popular resentment against governmental policies that transferred wealth from productive populations to the imperial treasury through the mechanism of currency debasement. The natural disasters that struck China during this period, including floods, famines, and epidemics that devastated agricultural production and reduced population across substantial portions of the realm, compounded the economic difficulties while straining governmental capacities for disaster relief and reconstruction that earlier Chinese dynasties had developed as essential functions of legitimate imperial authority. The Yellow River flooding that occurred during the 1340s and 1350s required massive labour mobilisation for flood control and channel reconstruction, creating conditions that generated both popular suffering and opportunities for organised resistance as peasant labourers brought together for public works. Projects discovered common grievances and developed organisational capabilities that could be redirected toward rebellion against the dynasty, whose governance had failed to prevent the disasters or adequately address their consequences. The rebellions that erupted across southern and central China during the 1350s drew upon multiple sources of discontent, while developing under the leadership of figures whose backgrounds in secret societies, religious movements, and bandit organisations provided organisational frameworks for popular mobilisation against Yuan authority. The Red Turban movement, whose members adopted distinctive red headgear as symbols of their commitment to millenarian religious teachings that prophesied the replacement of the current corrupt order with a purified realm governed according to Buddhist principles, emerged as one of the most significant organised challenges to Yuan governance, while fragmenting into competing factions whose rivalries prevented unified action against the common Mongol enemy. The White Lotus teachings that informed much Red Turban ideology drew upon traditions of popular Buddhism that had long provided frameworks for peasant resistance to governmental authority, promising the imminent arrival of the Maitreya Buddha, whose appearance would inaugurate an age of peace and justice that would replace the suffering and injustice of the present era. The combination of economic grievance, religious inspiration, and organisational capability that characterised the Red Turban and related movements created challenges to Yuan authority that differed fundamentally from the military threats that earlier Mongol Khans had successfully defeated through the application of overwhelming force against opponents whose conventional military organisations proved vulnerable to Mongol tactical superiority. The fragmentation of rebel movements into competing factions created opportunities for ambitious leaders to consolidate personal power, while gradually eliminating rivals whose initial cooperation in resistance to Yuan authority gave way to violent competition for supremacy among the anti-Mongol forces. The figure who would eventually emerge victorious from this competition, a former peasant and Buddhist novice named Zhu Yuanzhang, demonstrated organizational and military capabilities that enabled him to transform a local rebel band into the nucleus of a new imperial dynasty while systematically defeating both Mongol forces and rival rebel leaders who contested his claims to supreme authority. Zhu Yuanzhang's origins in the poorer strata of Chinese peasant society, his early experiences as a wandering beggar and Buddhist monk during the disasters that had devastated his native region, and his subsequent rise to leadership within the rebel movements that challenged Yuan authority, all contributed to a worldview that combined intense suspicion of potential rivals with genuine concern for the welfare of the common people whose suffering he had personally experienced before his elevation to power. The military campaigns that Zhu Yuanzhang conducted during the 1360s progressively expanded his territorial control, while eliminating the competing rebel leaders whose continued independence would have prevented the consolidation of unified authority that legitimate dynastic succession required. The capture of the Yuan capital at Khanbalik in 1368 by forces loyal to Zhu Yuanzhang marked the formal end of a Mongol rule over China and the establishment of the Ming dynasty that would govern Chinese territories for nearly 3 centuries until its own overthrow by Manchu invaders in 1644. The Mongol court that fled northward from the advancing Ming armies represented the continuation of Yuan dynastic claims even as effective Mongol authority over Chinese territories collapsed, establishing what later historians would call the Northern Yuan dynasty that maintained Chinggisid succession in the Mongolian steppes while permanently losing access to the agricultural wealth and administrative sophistication that Chinese territories had provided to the Yuan imperial system. The expulsion of the Mongols from China represented the most dramatic demonstration of the reversibility of conquest that the 13th century campaigns had seemed to establish as permanent features of the political landscape, as populations whose military capabilities had proven inadequate to prevent Mongol conquest nonetheless retained the demographic weight and organizational traditions that enabled the eventual reassertion of native rule over territories that foreign invaders had governed for nearly a century. The Ming dynasty that Zhu Yuanzhang founded as the Hongwu Emperor implemented policies specifically designed to eliminate the traces of Mongol influence that Yuan governance had introduced, while reasserting the primacy of Chinese cultural traditions that foreign rule had subordinated to Mongol preferences and administrative conveniences. The reconstruction of Chinese governmental institutions along lines that emphasized continuity with pre-Mongol traditions represented conscious efforts to restore legitimacy through connection to the Tang and Song dynasties, whose cultural achievements had established standards for civilized governance that Mongol rule had corrupted through the introduction of foreign personnel, practices and preferences. The hostility toward commerce and foreign contact that characterized early Ming policies reflected both Confucian suspicion of merchant activities and specific reactions against the commercial orientation that Yuan governance had encouraged, as the new dynasty sought to restore the primacy of agricultural production and scholarly administration over the merchant networks and foreign trade that had flourished under Mongol protection. The withdrawal from maritime engagement that the Ming dynasty would eventually implement, culminating in the abandonment of the ambitious naval expeditions that Admiral Genghis conducted during the early 15th century, reflected this broader reorientation away from the commercial and international connections that Mongol rule had facilitated toward a more inward-looking focus on domestic agriculture and cultural restoration. The territories of the former Mongol Empire that lay beyond China's borders continued under the governance of successor states, whose rulers maintained claims to Chinggisid legitimacy while pursuing increasingly independent policies that reflected the particular circumstances and populations of their respective domains. The Golden Horde, which had governed the western steppes and the Russian principalities since Batu Khan's conquests in the 13th century, entered a period of progressive fragmentation during the 15th century as competing claimants to Khanate authority established independent successor states whose rivalries prevented the maintenance of unified control over territories that had once acknowledged a single ruler. The emergence of the Kazan Khanate, the Crimean Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, and other successor polities from the dissolution of Golden Horde authority created the fragmented political landscape that would eventually enable Russian expansion across territories whose division among competing Tatar rulers prevented the coordinated resistance that might have checked Muscovite ambitions. The relationship between the Russian principalities and their Mongol overlords had evolved substantially since the initial conquest, as the tribute payments and political subordination that had characterized the early period of Mongol dominance gave way to more complex interactions that enabled the gradual strengthening of Russian power, while Mongol authority fragmented among competing successors to the once unified Golden Horde. The rise of Moscow as the dominant Russian principality owed much to the opportunities that cooperation with Mongol authority had provided during the period of Tatar overlordship, as Muscovite princes secured advantages over competing Russian rulers through their effectiveness as collectors of tribute and their cultivation of favourable relationships with the Khans, whose support could advance or retard the ambitions of their Russian subordinates. The transformation of Moscow from a relatively minor principality into the nucleus of a future empire reflected the strategic advantages that its geographic position, its cooperative relationship with Mongol authority, and the political skills of its ruling dynasty all combined to provide during the centuries when Russian principalities remained formally subordinate to the Golden Horde. The eventual emergence of Moscow as an independent power, capable of challenging and ultimately destroying the successor states that had fragmented from Golden Horde authority, represented one of the most significant long-term consequences of the Mongol period in Russian history, as the political consolidation that Mongol overlordship had paradoxically encouraged created the foundations for the Russian Empire that would eventually extend across the Eurasian landmass to the Pacific Ocean. The conquest of Kazan by Ivan IV in 1552, followed by the capture of Astrakhan in 1556, marked the decisive reversal of the political relationship that Mongol conquest had established 3 centuries earlier, as Russian military power proved capable of destroying the Tatar successor states whose authority over Russian populations had once seemed as permanent as any feature of the political landscape. The Chagatai Khanate that had governed the Central Asian territories since the original division of Genghis Khan's empire among his sons experienced its own process of fragmentation and transformation, as the tensions between sedentary populations in the western portions of the realm and nomadic traditions in the eastern steppes eventually produced the division into Mogolistan and Transoxiana that preceded further political fragmentation. The figure of Timur, who rose to power in the late 14th century from relatively obscure origins within the Chagatai domains, demonstrated that the military traditions and political methods that had enabled Mongol conquest remained capable of producing spectacular if temporary success, even as the original Mongol Empire had dissolved into competing successor states. Timur's campaigns, which devastated territories from India to Anatolia and from the Russian steppes to the Persian Gulf, represented conscious efforts to recreate the imperial achievements of Genghis Khan, while acknowledging through the maintenance of puppet Chinggisid Khans that legitimate authority over the Mongol heritage required connection to the sacred bloodline that Temujin's descendants alone could provide. The empire that Timur constructed through 3 decades of nearly continuous warfare collapsed rapidly after his death in 1405, as his descendants proved unable to maintain the unity that his personal authority had imposed while competing among themselves for shares of the territories that their ancestors' conquests had accumulated. The Timurid successor states that emerged from the dissolution of Timur's empire nonetheless maintained cultural traditions that combined Persian administrative sophistication with the martial heritage of the steppe, producing the remarkable cultural flowering that characterized 15th century Herat and Samarkand, while establishing precedents that Timur's descendants would carry to India when Babur founded the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. The Mughal dynasty that governed substantial portions of the Indian subcontinent from 1526 until British colonialism finally extinguished its authority in the 19th century, represented the most enduring political legacy of the Timurid tradition, as rulers who traced their ancestry to both Timur and Genghis Khan constructed an empire whose administrative sophistication, cultural achievements, and territorial extent rivaled the greatest powers of the early modern world. The Persian language and culture that the Mughals promoted as the medium of elite communication and artistic expression reflected the synthesis of nomadic military traditions with settled administrative practices that had characterized Mongol governance since the earliest conquests, while the religious policies that Mughal emperors developed attempted to manage the diversity of a population whose Hindu majority lived under rulers whose Islamic faith represented minority religious commitment requiring careful political management. The Ilkhanate that had governed Persia and the Middle East since Hulagu's conquests experienced its own process of dissolution during the 14th century as the conversion of the ruling dynasty to Islam, which had occurred under Genghis Khan in the 1290s, failed to prevent the internal conflicts and succession disputes that progressively fragmented political authority across the former Ilkhanate territories. The competing dynasties that emerged from Ilkhanate dissolution, including the Jalarids, the Muzaffarids, and other regional powers, created the fragmented political landscape that Timur's campaigns would later devastate, while establishing patterns of regional autonomy and cultural development that would characterize Persian politics until the Safavid unification of the 16th century. The Safavid dynasty that eventually reunified Persian territories and established Twelver Shia Islam as the official religion of the realm drew upon traditions of religious authority and political legitimacy that differed substantially from the Chinggisid models that had governed earlier periods, while nonetheless inheriting administrative traditions and territorial claims that reflected the transformations that Mongol and Timurid rule had introduced to the region. The legacy of Mongol conquest extended far beyond the political boundaries that successor states maintained or contested, encompassing transformations in trade patterns, disease transmission, technological diffusion, and cultural exchange that reshaped the medieval world even as the unified empire that had facilitated these exchanges fragmented into competing polities. The Black Death that devastated Eurasian populations during the 14th century travelled along the trade routes and communication networks that Mongol conquest had established and protected, as the plague bacillus moved from its endemic reservoirs in Central Asian rodent populations to the commercial centres of China, the Middle East, and eventually Europe, where its arrival precipitated demographic catastrophe that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of European populations within a few years of its initial appearance. The epidemic's transmission across the vast distances that separated its Central Asian origins from its Mediterranean endpoints demonstrated the connectivity that Mongol peace had created, as the same networks that carried luxury goods, diplomatic missions, and religious travellers also enabled the spread of infectious disease whose consequences exceeded any deliberate human action in their transformative impact on populations across the medieval world. The demographic collapse that the Black Death produced contributed to the economic disruptions and social upheavals that characterized the 14th century across Eurasia, while the labour shortages that resulted from massive population decline created conditions that would eventually reshape social relations between peasants and landlords in ways that differed significantly across the various regions that the epidemic had affected. The technologies that Mongol conquest had facilitated moving across Eurasia included innovations in warfare, manufacturing, and communication, whose effects would reshape global history long after the empire that had enabled their transmission had dissolved into competing successor states. The gunpowder weapons that Chinese artisans had developed over centuries of experimentation and refinement spread westward along the trade routes that Mongol protection had secured, reaching European hands through the commercial and diplomatic exchanges that Mongol peace had enabled, while undergoing further development and modification as different military traditions adapted the new technology to their particular tactical requirements. The printing technologies that Chinese craftsmen had pioneered similarly diffused westward during the period of Mongol connectivity, providing knowledge and perhaps inspiration for the development of printing in Europe that would eventually transform religious, intellectual, and political life through the mass reproduction of texts that manuscript culture could never achieve. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge that Islamic scholars had accumulated through centuries of translation and original research similarly spread across the Mongol realm, reaching Chinese scholars who incorporated foreign learning into their own traditions, while contributing Chinese innovations to the cosmopolitan intellectual exchanges that Mongol patronage encouraged. The religious transformations that Mongol conquest and governance had facilitated left permanent marks on the spiritual landscape of Eurasia, as the tolerance that Mongol policy had extended to all religious traditions enabled the spread of Islam across territories where Buddhist, shamanist, and Christian populations had previously predominated. The conversion of the Western Khanates to Islam during the 13th and 14th centuries, proceeding through the gradual adoption of the faith by ruling elites, whose subjects eventually followed their example, permanently transformed the religious geography of Central Asia and the Western steppes, while establishing the Islamic character that these regions would maintain through subsequent centuries of political transformation. The displacement of Buddhism from regions where it had once flourished, including much of Central Asia and the western portions of the Mongol realm, represented one of the most significant consequences of the religious policies that Mongol rulers had implemented, as the tolerance that had initially protected Buddhist institutions eventually gave way to the preferential treatment of Islam that converted rulers extended to their newly adopted faith. The collapse of Mongol unity during the 14th century transformed the political geography of Eurasia in ways that would shape international relations for centuries to come, as the fragmentation of the world's largest contiguous empire created the conditions from which new powers would eventually emerge to contest the regions that Mongol Khans had once ruled without serious challenge. The Ming dynasty that displaced Mongol rule in China after 1368 represented the restoration of native Chinese governance over territories that foreign conquerors had administered for nearly a century, while the new dynasty's determination to eliminate all vestiges of Mongol influence shaped policies ranging from cultural purification to military defence that characterised Ming governance throughout its nearly 3 centuries of rule. The Great Wall's reconstruction and extension during the Ming period reflected the continuing threat that Mongol forces posed along China's northern frontier, as the defensive fortifications that earlier dynasties had begun and that Mongol conquest had rendered temporarily obsolete became once again essential to Chinese security in an era when steppe cavalry remained capable of devastating raids into agricultural territory whenever the defences proved inadequate to contain them. The military reforms that Ming emperors implemented to counter Mongol threats included the development of firearms and artillery that Chinese forces employed against the steppe cavalry, whose mounted archery had once given them decisive tactical advantages, while the technological competition between settled agricultural societies and mobile pastoral peoples that had characterized inner Asian history for millennia continued in new forms as both sides adapted to changing military realities. The cultural transformations that Mongol rule had produced within China persisted even as the political structures that had enabled them dissolved, as the Yuan dynasty's legacy included artistic styles, religious practices, and intellectual traditions that Ming rulers could not entirely eliminate, regardless of their determination to restore purely Chinese cultural forms. The drama and vernacular literature that had flourished under Mongol patronage, when Chinese scholars excluded from government service had turned to popular entertainment as an alternative outlet for their talents, continued to develop under Ming rule, even as the civil service examination system that Mongol rulers had intermittently suspended resumed its traditional function as the pathway to official careers. The religious syncretism that Mongol tolerance had enabled, combining Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian elements in new configurations that reflected the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Yuan China, similarly persisted into subsequent periods despite official efforts to maintain clearer boundaries between different spiritual traditions. The cartographic and geographic knowledge that Mongol administration had accumulated, reflecting the empire's need to understand and manage territories of unprecedented extent, passed to Ming officials who used this information to conceptualize their own realm and its relationships with neighbouring states in ways that reflected Mongol precedents, even when Ming ideology emphasized discontinuity with the foreign dynasty that had preceded native rule. The Russian emergence from Mongol domination during the 15th and 16th centuries similarly reflected the complex legacy that Tatar rule had left upon the political and social structures of Eastern European populations, as the Muscovite state that eventually unified Russian territories borrowed institutional forms and governing practices from the Khanast that had once extracted tribute from Russian princes. The centralized autocracy that characterized Russian governance during the early modern period reflected both Byzantine and Mongol influences, whose relative importance historians have long debated, while the service nobility whose obligations to the sovereign resembled the military duties that Mongol military organization had imposed upon dependent populations, demonstrated the institutional continuity that conquest could produce even across dramatic political ruptures. The expansion of Muscovite power across Siberia during the 16th and 17th centuries followed the routes and utilized the knowledge that Mongol administration had accumulated over centuries of controlling inner Asian territories, as Russian explorers and traders pushed eastward through regions whose geography and populations Mongol predecessors had already mapped and catalogued in the course of imperial governance. The incorporation of Tatar populations into the expanding Russian state required accommodations between Orthodox Christian rulers and Muslim subjects whose interactions would shape Russian approaches to religious diversity throughout the imperial period, while the military techniques and administrative practices that Russian forces employed in subduing steppe populations reflected lessons learned during centuries of interaction with Mongol overlords, who had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of governing pastoral peoples from sedentary centres. The transformation of the western steppes under the influence of Mongol successor states created the political conditions from which the Crimean Khanate, the Kazakh Khanate, and other Turkic and Mongol polities would emerge to contest the vast grasslands that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of China. The slave trade that connected the Black Sea region to Ottoman markets represented one of the most significant economic activities that steppe populations conducted during the centuries following Mongol imperial collapse, as raiding parties carried captives from Eastern European settlements to commercial centres, where human merchandise commanded premium prices that made such expeditions economically attractive despite the risks they entailed. The military pressure that Crimean Tatars and other steppe peoples continued to exert upon Russian, Polish and Lithuanian territories demonstrated the persistence of the raiding economy that had characterized steppe sedentary relations for millennia, while the diplomatic and commercial relationships that linked steppe khanates to the Ottoman Empire created alliance systems that would influence European politics through the early modern period and beyond. The gradual Russian conquest of these steppe territories during the 18th and 19th centuries required military campaigns and administrative innovations whose costs and consequences reflected the difficulty of subduing populations whose mobility and martial traditions made them formidable opponents even against forces equipped with increasingly sophisticated firearms and supported by the economic resources that sedentary states could mobilize. The Central Asian Khanates that emerged from the fragmentation of the Chagatai domain maintained political traditions and cultural practices derived from the Mongol imperial period through centuries of subsequent transformation, as Uzbek, Kazakh, and other Turkic peoples who had absorbed Mongol military and governmental techniques created states that combined nomadic political traditions with the administrative requirements of controlling urban populations and agricultural territories. The cities that had flourished under Mongol protection, including Samarkand, Bukhara, and Herat, remained centres of Islamic learning and artistic production during the centuries following imperial collapse, while the Persian and Turkic literary traditions that Timurid patronage had cultivated continued to influence cultural production across the Islamic world long after the political structures that had supported them had dissolved. The architectural masterpieces that adorned these Central Asian cities reflected the aesthetic sensibilities that Mongol conquest had spread across Eurasia, as the artistic traditions of China, Persia, and the Islamic heartlands had mixed under imperial patronage to create hybrid styles whose influence would persist through subsequent centuries of political transformation. The madrasas and mosques that Timurid and post-Timurid rulers constructed in these urban centres maintained the religious and educational functions that had characterized Islamic cities for centuries, while incorporating decorative elements whose origins in different cultural traditions testified to the exchanges that Mongol connectivity had enabled. The memory of Mongol conquest shaped the identities and aspirations of populations across Eurasia through mechanisms that combined historical remembrance with genealogical imagination, as ruling dynasties from India to Russia claimed descent from Genghis Khan or his commanders, while ordinary people preserved traditions that connected their communities to the era of Mongol supremacy. The prestige that Chinggisid lineage conferred upon rulers who could demonstrate biological descent from the world, Conqueror reflected the continuing power of Mongol memory, even in contexts where actual Mongol political authority had long since dissolved, as dynasties that sought legitimacy in the eyes of their subjects and rivals found that connection to Genghis Khan's bloodline provided credentials that no other ancestry could match. The Mughal emperors who ruled India from the 16th through the 19th centuries took their dynastic name from the Persian word for Mongol, emphasizing the Chinggisid and Timurid ancestry that connected them to the greatest conquerors of Central Asian history, while governing populations whose own experiences of Mongol invasion had been relatively limited compared to the devastation that other regions had suffered. The political ideologies that Mughal rulers developed combined Turco-Mongol traditions of military conquest with Persian administrative sophistication and Islamic religious principles to create a distinctive imperial culture whose magnificence rivaled any contemporary civilization, while reflecting the hybrid origins that Mongol empire building had made possible. The architectural achievements that Mughal patronage produced, including the Taj Mahal and the great mosques and palaces of Delhi, Agra and Lahore, represented the culmination of artistic traditions whose development had been shaped by the cultural exchanges that Mongol connectivity had enabled over preceding centuries. The historiographical traditions that preserved and transmitted knowledge of Mongol conquest shaped understandings of the past that influenced political discourse and cultural identity through subsequent centuries, as chroniclers and historians in different linguistic and religious traditions crafted narratives that emphasized the aspects of Mongol history most relevant to their own communities and concerns. The Persian historical writing that Rashid al-Din and his successors had pioneered remained the most comprehensive source of information about Mongol affairs for scholars across the Islamic world, while the Chinese dynastic histories that Yuan and Ming officials compiled provided perspectives shaped by Confucian political thought and the particular experiences of populations who had witnessed Mongol governance at close range. The European accounts of Mongol conquest, derived partly from travellers' observations and partly from the terrified reports of populations who had suffered invasion, portrayed the Mongols primarily as destructive forces whose violence had threatened Christian civilization itself, while downplaying the administrative sophistication and cultural patronage that had characterized Mongol governance at its peak. The Russian chronicles that recorded centuries of Mongol dominion over Eastern Slavic populations similarly emphasized the suffering that foreign rule had inflicted, while attributing to that experience formative influences on Russian political culture whose nature and extent would remain subjects of scholarly debate through subsequent centuries. The environmental transformations that Mongol conquest had produced persisted long after the political structures that had caused them had dissolved, as the demographic collapse that warfare and epidemic disease had inflicted upon certain regions permanently altered landscapes and ecosystems in ways that subsequent recovery could not entirely reverse. The agricultural abandonment that depopulation had produced in regions like northern China, Iran and Central Asia allowed forests and grasslands to reclaim territory that human cultivation had previously claimed, while the irrigation systems and terraced fields that had sustained intensive agricultural production deteriorated without the labour required to maintain them against the constant pressures of erosion and decay. The wild animals that returned to regions emptied of human habitation, including wolves, deer, and other species that human activity had previously suppressed, re-established populations whose recovery testified to the scale of the demographic disaster that Mongol conquest and its associated disruptions had inflicted upon human communities. The reforestation that accompanied agricultural abandonment may have affected regional and perhaps global climate through the carbon absorption that growing forests produced, as the vegetation reclaiming abandoned farmland sequestered atmospheric carbon dioxide in quantities sufficient to have detectable climatic effects during the centuries following Mongol conquest. The trade networks that Mongol protection had established continued to function in modified forms even after the political unity that had enabled their safest and most efficient operation had dissolved, as merchants adapted to the new conditions created by competing successor states, whose rivalries complicated but did not entirely prevent commercial exchange across the vast distances that the Silk Road had always traversed. The maritime commerce that had developed as an alternative to overland routes during the period of Mongol connectivity continued to expand through subsequent centuries, as Chinese, Arab, Indian, and eventually European traders developed shipping technologies and commercial networks that would eventually eclipse the land routes that had connected east and west since ancient times. The European voyages of exploration that commenced during the 15th century reflected in part the desire to circumvent the barriers that Muslim and Mongol successor states interposed between European markets and Asian sources of luxury goods, as Portuguese and Spanish navigators sought oceanic routes to the Indies that would allow direct commercial relationships without the intermediaries who had long controlled overland trade. The global commercial networks that European maritime expansion would eventually create represented a fundamental transformation of the trading systems that Mongol connectivity had temporarily unified, as oceanic routes replaced overland pathways and new centres of commercial activity emerged in locations whose geographic advantages derived from their access to sea lanes rather than their positions along traditional caravan routes. The memories of Mongol violence remained embedded in the cultural traditions of populations who had suffered invasion, even as the political and economic consequences of conquest gradually faded, as folk traditions, religious narratives, and historical accounts transmitted across generations the terror and devastation that Mongol armies had inflicted upon communities throughout Eurasia. The sack of Baghdad retained its power as a symbol of civilizational catastrophe, in Islamic historical consciousness, representing the moment when the political and cultural achievements of centuries had been swept away by forces that seemed to embody chaos and destruction in their most terrifying forms. The fall of Kiev similarly functioned in Russian and Ukrainian historical memory as a foundational trauma, whose consequences had shaped the subsequent development of Eastern Slavic peoples, while the burning of countless smaller communities whose names had not survived in historical records represented losses whose cumulative weight exceeded any individual catastrophe in their impact upon the populations who had inhabited them. The psychological and cultural effects of such devastating experiences upon surviving populations remained difficult to assess across the intervening centuries, yet the persistence of trauma narratives in traditions transmitted across dozens of generations suggested that collective memory preserved something of the emotional reality that original witnesses had experienced, even as specific details faded into legendary obscurity. The scholarly debates that modern historians have conducted regarding the Mongol Empire's significance reflect the complexity of assessing a phenomenon whose effects were simultaneously destructive and creative, whose violence was undeniable, yet whose contributions to global connectivity were equally evident. The attempts to calculate the death toll that Mongol conquest inflicted upon Eurasian populations have produced estimates ranging from 30 to 40 million people, figures whose magnitude exceeds the casualties of most subsequent conflicts, while remaining impossible to verify with precision given the limitations of medieval demographic evidence. The economic disruptions that accompanied conquest, including the destruction of irrigation systems, the interruption of agricultural production, and the devastation of urban centres that had served as nodes of commercial and cultural exchange, produced secondary effects that may have exceeded the direct casualties of military operations in their impact upon populations whose survival depended upon the infrastructure that warfare had damaged. The long-term benefits that some historians have attributed to Mongol rule, including the facilitation of commercial exchange, the protection of merchants and travellers, and the cultural patronage that imperial wealth enabled, must be weighed against the costs that conquest had imposed upon populations whose suffering had made such benefits possible for others. The Mongol Empire that Temujin had created through decades of warfare and political manipulation thus left marks upon the world that subsequent centuries could not entirely erase, as the transformations that conquest had produced in political organisation, commercial networks, cultural exchange, and demographic distribution shaped the conditions from which the modern world would eventually emerge. The unified command structure that had enabled a relatively small population of pastoral nomads to conquer the most populous and sophisticated civilizations of medieval Eurasia, demonstrated possibilities of military organisation that would influence subsequent state builders who sought to replicate Mongol success through adaptation of the techniques that had proven so devastatingly effective. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol governance at its most sophisticated provided a model of imperial management that subsequent rulers would sometimes emulate when confronting the challenge of controlling religiously diverse populations whose loyalties might otherwise fragment along sectarian lines. The meritocratic principles that had allowed talented individuals to rise within Mongol military and administrative hierarchies regardless of their birth status suggested alternatives to the hereditary privileges that characterized most medieval social systems, even if the empire's own dissolution demonstrated the limits of such principles when confronted with the pressures of succession politics and elite resistance to practices that threatened established interests. The image of Genghis Khan himself underwent continuous transformation across the centuries following his death, as different communities appropriated his memory for purposes that reflected their own circumstances and concerns, rather than the historical reality of the man who had lived and conquered during the early 13th century. The figure who appeared as a monster of destruction in European and Middle Eastern accounts became a culture hero in Mongolian tradition, remembered as the unifier who had brought peace to the warring tribes and the lawgiver whose ordinances had established principles of social organisation that would guide his people through subsequent centuries. The rehabilitation of Genghis Khan's reputation in modern Mongolia, following the collapse of Soviet-imposed restrictions on celebrating his memory, demonstrated the political utility that heroic ancestors could provide for nations seeking historical foundations for contemporary national identity. The controversies that this rehabilitation provoked among populations whose ancestors had suffered under Mongol rule illustrated the continuing emotional power of memories that connected present communities to the experiences of distant predecessors, as the same figure who represented national greatness for Mongolians represented trauma and loss for communities descended from those who had experienced conquest from the perspective of its victims. The fragmentation that had divided the Mongol Empire during the 14th century thus represented not merely the dissolution of a political structure, but the transformation of a unified historical phenomenon into the separate histories of the peoples and regions that had been temporarily joined under a single ruling house. The successor states that emerged from imperial collapse developed along trajectories shaped by the particular conditions of their regions, as the Islamicization of the Western Khanates, the Sinification of the Yuan dynasty, and the persistence of nomadic political traditions in the Mongol heartland produced outcomes that diverged increasingly as generations passed and memories of unity faded. The cultural and commercial connections that had linked these regions during the period of Mongol supremacy survived in attenuated forms, as merchants, scholars, and religious practitioners continued to traverse routes that had once enjoyed imperial protection, even as the political fragmentation that accompanied dissolution complicated journeys that had previously been relatively secure. The knowledge that had accumulated regarding distant regions and peoples persisted in texts and traditions that subsequent generations could consult, while the personal relationships and institutional connections that had linked communities across Eurasia gradually dissolved as the generations that had established them passed from the scene. The empire that a boy abandoned on the steppe had created through the relentless application of military genius and political cunning thus achieved a significance that transcended the relatively brief period during which its political structures had actually functioned, as the transformations that Mongol conquest had produced in trade networks, disease transmission, technological diffusion, and cultural exchange reshaped the conditions of human existence across the medieval world in ways that would influence the emergence of the modern era. The Mongol Empire had demonstrated that the world was connected in ways that previous generations had only dimly perceived, as the routes that carried merchants and missionaries across Eurasia also transmitted diseases, technologies, and ideas whose effects exceeded any deliberate intention on the part of those who had facilitated their movement. The globalization that modern scholars have identified as a defining characteristic of contemporary existence found precedence in the connectivity that Mongol rule had temporarily established across the vast distances separating the Pacific from the Mediterranean, precedents whose study illuminated both the possibilities and the costs that integration of distant regions could produce. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who had contested his inheritance through generations of warfare and political competition, had each contributed to the empire's legacy in ways that reflected their individual circumstances and capabilities, while the collective enterprise that they had sustained for more than a century transformed the world they had conquered in ways none of them could have entirely foreseen. The armies that had carried Mongol standards to the borders of Egypt, the forests of Poland, and the shores of Japan had created fear and devastation on a scale that previous history had rarely witnessed, while the administrators who had governed the territories that conquest had acquired had developed techniques of imperial management whose sophistication rivaled the most advanced civilizations of their era. The scholars who had translated texts between Arabic, Persian, Chinese, and Mongolian under imperial patronage had created foundations for cross-cultural understanding that would influence subsequent intellectual exchange, while the merchants who had travelled under the protection that Mongol peace provided had established commercial relationships whose patterns would persist, even after the political conditions that had enabled them had dissolved. The story of the Mongol Empire thus encompasses both the terror that conquest inflicted upon populations across Eurasia and the connections that imperial unity enabled between regions that had previously known little of each other's existence, a duality that challenges simple judgments while illuminating fundamental dynamics of human historical experience. The violence that had accompanied the empire's creation and the suffering that populations had endured under Mongol rule represented costs whose magnitude could not be minimized or justified by appeals to subsequent benefits, while the transformations that Mongol connectivity had produced in trade, technology, and culture represented effects whose significance exceeded the intentions of those whose actions had made them possible. The memory of both the destruction and the creation that the Mongol Empire had wrought persisted across subsequent centuries in traditions that different communities emphasized according to their particular experiences and concerns, as the same historical phenomenon appeared as catastrophe or achievement, depending on the perspective from which observers regarded events whose complexity exceeded any single interpretive framework. The boy named Temujin, who had survived abandonment on the harsh Mongolian steppe, had become the conqueror whose armies reshaped the political geography of Eurasia, whose empire facilitated exchanges that transformed medieval civilization, and whose legacy continued to influence the identities and aspirations of populations across the vast territories that his descendants had once ruled. The transformation from abandoned child to world conqueror represented one of history's most dramatic personal trajectories. Yet the empire that Temujin had created extended far beyond any individual achievement to encompass the collective efforts of the armies that had conquered, the administrators who had governed, and the populations who had sustained the imperial enterprise through generations of political transformation. The Mongol Empire that emerged from the unification of the steppe tribes and expanded to become the largest contiguous land empire in human history left marks upon the world that subsequent centuries could not erase, as the memories of conquest, the patterns of trade, and the technologies of warfare that Mongol rule had spread continued to shape human affairs long after the political structures that had enabled them had dissolved into the competing successor states whose rivalries would characterize subsequent Eurasian history.